Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. The first clue appeared in a place where nothing had been written for nearly 30 years. At the edge of the coastal town's small historical archive, there was an old weathered logbook used by the harbor office during the 1980s. Most of its pages had long since turned yellow and soft with age. But one page near the end was not yellow. It was new. The paper was clean, white, and uniged, as though it had been placed there very recently. And written on it, in slow, careful handwriting, were only 5 words, still drifting past the North Buoy. No date, no signature, just those words. The archivist who eventually noticed the page did not remember adding it. In fact, the logbook had not even been opened in years. The harbor itself was quiet that morning. Soft gray light moved slowly across the water while gulls drifted lazily above the docks. The town of Alder Cove sat along a long stretch of cold northern coastline where the ocean moved gently between long rocky peninsulas and scattered fishing islands. It was the kind of place where days often passed with very little change. Boats left in the morning, boats returned in the evening, and most of the people who lived there had known each other for decades. The North Buoy mentioned in the note floated far from shore, marking a shallow reef where old fishing boats had once run aground. These days, very few vessels passed that way. The water there was wide and quiet. When the strange page was eventually mentioned to the harbor office, no one recognized the handwriting, and no one had recorded any activity near the buoy in years. Still, the message lingered in the minds of the few people who heard about it. Because in Alder Cove, certain memories had never completely disappeared, especially the memory of a small fishing boat called the Maribel. The Maribel had vanished nearly 28 years earlier. It was a modest wooden trawler that belonged to a quiet local fisherman named Thomas Bell. Thomas had lived alone in a small cedar house near the southern docks. He had been known for keeping unusual hours, often leaving before sunrise, often returning well after dark. But he was steady and predictable in one way. He always logged his departure and return times in the harbor records, except on the final day the Maribel was seen. That morning, the boat left the harbor slowly through a layer of drifting fog. No one thought much of it at the time. Fog was common along that stretch of coast, and Thomas had navigated those waters his entire life. But by the following afternoon, the Maribel had not returned. At first, the harbor master assumed the boat had simply traveled farther offshore than usual. But 2 days later, concern began to settle quietly through the town. The Coast Guard searched the surrounding waters. They found no wreckage, no nets, no floating equipment, and no sign of Thomas Bell. What made the disappearance unusual was not the lack of debris. It was the weather. The sea had been calm. The wind had been light, and there had been no storms anywhere along the coast that week. For months afterward, boats occasionally passed near the North Buoy while scanning the water out of habit, but nothing was ever found. Eventually, the search ended, and the Maribel became one more quiet mystery absorbed into the slow rhythm of the town. Years passed. Fishing boats changed owners. Dock buildings were repaired, and new people moved into homes along the hills above the harbor. But small details about the disappearance never fully disappeared. Some fishermen remembered seeing a dim light far beyond the reef on the morning Thomas vanished. Others recalled hearing the slow sound of a boat engine somewhere beyond the fog long after sunrise. But memories along the coast often blurred with time, and no clear explanation ever formed. The white page in the archive logbook brought those old conversations quietly back. The harbor master eventually retrieved the old records from the year the Mirabelle disappeared. He spent several calm evenings reading through faded ink entries while the harbor outside settled into darkness. Most of the logs were ordinary. Boat departures, fuel deliveries, minor repairs. But one entry written 2 weeks before the disappearance caught his attention. It described a complaint from another fisherman. According to the note, someone had reported seeing the Mirabelle drifting near the north buoy late at night, with no running lights, no engine sound, just slowly moving with the tide. The fisherman who filed the report later admitted he might have mistaken another vessel in the distance. Still, the entry remained, and now, decades later, the words on the strange new page seemed to echo the same quiet location, still drifting past the north buoy. The harbor master eventually shared the discovery with a small regional investigator named Lena Carver. Lena worked quietly across several coastal towns, often reviewing unusual cases that had never fully resolved. She arrived in Alder Cove during a gray morning when the ocean looked almost perfectly still. The town was smaller than she expected. A few narrow streets, a general store, and long wooden docks that creaked gently when the tide moved beneath them. She spent the first day simply walking the harbor, listening to the water against the pilings, watching the slow movement of fishing boats returning with their morning catch. Nothing about the place felt tense or urgent, but sometimes quiet places held long memories beneath their calm surface. Lena began by visiting the small cedar house where Thomas Bell had once lived. It sat on a low bluff above the southern docks. The house had changed owners twice since his disappearance, but the structure itself remained largely the same. A narrow porch, weathered railings, windows facing the open water. Inside, the current owners mentioned something they had always found slightly unusual. In the back storage room, there was an old locked cabinet that had been left behind when they purchased the house. They had never forced it open, mostly because it seemed unimportant. Just an old wooden cabinet tucked against the wall. Lena examined it quietly. The wood was dry and worn with age, but the small brass lock had been replaced at some point, much more recently than the cabinet itself. When the cabinet was eventually opened, it revealed a stack of thin notebooks, each one labeled with simple dates, fishing routes, tide patterns, weather notes. Thomas Bell had apparently kept careful personal logs of his time on the water. Most of the entries were routine: water temperature, fish movement, engine maintenance. But during the final month before his disappearance, a new detail appeared repeatedly. A brief note written in the margins of several pages. Drift seen again near buoy. Sometimes the words were followed by a small question mark, sometimes by nothing at all. Lena closed the notebook slowly. Outside, the quiet harbor stretched out toward the gray horizon. Far beyond the docks, somewhere past the shallow reef, the north buoy continued to rise and fall gently with the tide, marking a quiet patch of ocean that few boats visited anymore. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, someone had written that whatever Thomas Bell had been noticing out there might still be drifting. Lena left the cedar house quietly, walking down the narrow path toward the southern docks. The wooden planks creaked gently under her boots, and the faint scent of salt and seaweed lingered in the air. She paused near a small boathouse at the end of the pier. Its paint had peeled long ago, leaving soft streaks of gray. Inside, old nets and rusted hooks lay in loose piles. One corner was filled with stacked wooden crates, some labeled with faded ink from decades before. Among the crates, Lena noticed a small bundle of notebooks tied with twine. She picked one up, brushing away a layer of dust. The pages were fragile, filled with sketches of the harbor, markings of currents, and faint symbols she did not recognize. Some sketches depicted the North Buoy from unusual angles, as if someone had been observing it from different positions on the water. The quiet of the boathouse made each sound, wind rattling the roof, water slapping against the docks, feel amplified, slow, and deliberate. She left the boathouse and walked along the shoreline. A thin mist hugged the rocks and sand, softening the distant outlines of abandoned shacks and cottages along the coast. One shack stood slightly apart, half hidden among driftwood and low shrubs. Its door hung on one hinge, swinging slowly in the breeze. Inside, the floorboard sagged under years of neglect. The room smelled of old timber and brine. On a rickety table in the corner lay a collection of faded maps and journals. Lena noticed faint notations in the margins, coordinates, times, small arrows pointing toward the North Buoy. No one had mentioned this shack in the town records. It seemed forgotten, as though it had waited quietly for someone to notice it again. She returned to the main street, passing the general store with its wooden sign swaying lightly. A few locals moved about, speaking softly, their voices low and careful. At the counter, the shopkeeper remembered Thomas Bell, or rather, his habits. He liked the quiet, the man said slowly, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. Never one for company when he went out. Would sometimes disappear for days, even before he vanished. Lena asked about the buoy, and the man hesitated. Old fishermen talk of strange lights out there, he murmured. Not always from boats. Flickers, shadows, sometimes a shape drifting. People stopped going near it years ago. Best left alone. Later, Lena followed a narrow road that led toward the cliffs on the northern edge of town. The asphalt was cracked, and tall grasses grew along the edges, brushing gently against the tires of her car. At the cliff's edge, she found a small ranger station, mostly deserted. The building leaned slightly to one side, as if listening to the wind. Inside, records from past years lay in neat stacks. She flipped through them slowly. Notes about missing equipment, small incidents at sea, and sporadic observations of objects floating near the North Buoy were scattered among mundane details. A single photograph caught her eye, a small wooden boat, darkened by water, floating near the buoy. The picture was undated, grainy, and almost imperceptible. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a soft golden light over the distant islands. Waves lapped quietly against the rocky shore. She drove back through a winding forest road. Pines leaned over the asphalt, their needles whispering softly in the breeze. On a small clearing, she noticed a weathered cabin, hidden among birch and spruce. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though the place seemed abandoned. Inside, Lena found more signs of careful observation. Journals, hand-drawn maps, and a series of small, empty bottles lined along the windowsill. The bottles were labeled with dates, some recent, some decades old, suggesting someone had kept a slow record of the tides and drift patterns for years. Walking along the nearby lake, Lena watched water lilies floating quietly on still water. The reflection of the clouds moved gently across the surface, shifting slowly with the wind. A faint path led to a small dock jutting into the lake. Wood creaked softly underfoot, sending tiny ripples across the otherwise undisturbed water. On the dock, a single rowboat rested, tethered loosely with frayed rope. It had no name, no markings, only signs of careful maintenance. She returned to town as the light faded completely, the streets now empty except for the distant hum of the ocean. From the harbor, The north buoy appeared as a faint dot against the horizon, moving subtly with the tide. Its quiet persistence seemed deliberate, almost watchful. And somewhere, beyond the reach of the town, the water carried whispers of old habits, old observations, and the drifting mystery of the Maribel, waiting for someone to notice it again. Lena parked near a deserted pier and sat silently, letting the dark settle around her. The faint glow of distant lighthouse beams swept slowly over the harbor, touching the water in gentle arcs. Each movement of the tide, each soft lap against the pilings, seemed to mark time in a rhythm almost forgotten. And she realized that the town's quiet streets, the abandoned cabins, and the forgotten docks were all part of a slow, patient record, one that had been kept far longer than anyone had noticed. Somewhere among the forested cliffs, the calm shoreline, and the mist-shrouded islands, a new piece of the puzzle waited. A soundless drift, a shape, a memory carried on the tide. And Lena knew the investigation would follow it, slowly, quietly, through each hidden place, each overlooked structure, each whispering edge of Alder Cove. Even as night deepened, the town settled into its rhythm, the ocean breathing softly against stone and sand, carrying secrets that refused to be rushed. The buoy continued its slow oscillation in the distance, and with it, the mystery persisted, calm, deliberate, and patient. Morning arrived slowly over Alder Cove. The mist hung low, softening the outlines of the harbor and turning the distant cliffs into pale, shadowed shapes. Lena walked along a quiet service road that ran parallel to the coastline. Gravel crunched gently beneath her boots as small waves lapped at the rocks below. A narrow trail led up into a copse of pines and firs. The forest smelled of damp earth and resin, the air cool and calm. Sunlight filtered in thin beams, creating faint patterns on the moss-covered ground. She followed the trail until she reached a small, abandoned ranger outpost tucked between the trees. The wooden structure sagged slightly, paint faded and flaking. Inside, dusty shelves held maps, notebooks, and small instruments, compasses, barometers, and tide-measuring tools. One notebook lay open, pages yellowed with age. On a page, Lena noticed a series of coordinates marked with faint pencil dots. They aligned roughly with the north buoy and several points along the shallow reefs. The markings suggested someone had been quietly tracking something over many years. The handwriting was neat, slow, deliberate. Outside, the wind rustled through the needles, the soft swish mingling with the distant calls of gulls. A deer moved cautiously through the underbrush, pausing to glance at her before disappearing into the forest. Returning to town, Lena stopped at a small cafe that had been there for decades. The owner, a woman with silver-streaked hair, remembered Thomas Bell. He was quiet, she said softly, pouring tea. Kept to himself mostly. But he had a habit of visiting the cafe late, writing notes in little notebooks. Never said much. She mentioned the north buoy. The woman's eyes narrowed. There were stories, she whispered. Old fishermen swore they saw shapes near it. Floating lights, figures in the mist. Some nights, it looked like the water moved differently, as if something was carried by the tide. Lena thanked her and left, taking the narrow back roads that followed the contours of the coastline. The asphalt was cracked, and weeds grew in the edges, brushing lightly against her tires. A turnoff led to a small lake nestled among the cliffs. The water was still, mirror-like, reflecting clouds that drifted slowly across the sky. A small cabin rested on the far side of the lake. Its roof was covered with moss, and smoke from a chimney suggested recent occupancy. She approached slowly. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a simple interior. Journals lay stacked on a table. Small sketches of boats, tide lines, and faint markings of lights on the water covered the pages. The cabin appeared lived in yet silent, as though someone had stepped away for only a moment. On the windowsill, a small rowboat model rested, its bow pointed toward the north buoy's approximate direction. Lena left the lake cabin and drove along a quiet country road that curved inland. Fields of tall grass swayed gently with the wind. A farmstead appeared, abandoned for years. The barn doors hung crookedly, the roof sagging. Inside, she found remnants of crates and fishing gear, stacked neatly as if someone had left them in a hurry. Among them was a small, unmarked bottle with water inside, slightly cloudy. A faint residue lined the glass. Lena paused, listening. The wind moved softly through the open barn doors, carrying the scent of damp earth and old timber. Back in town, she visited a small antique shop. The owner, a quiet man with lined features, remembered Thomas's routine purchases: old maps, compasses, and tide charts. Always studying the waters, he said, voice low. He believed there were patterns no one else noticed, things that moved quietly unnoticed. Lena took note of the descriptions, walking out into the calm streets. The harbor lay ahead, water gently swaying against the piers. A narrow dock jutted farther into the harbor than the others. Lena stepped onto it, letting her fingers trail along the weathered wood. Beneath her, the water shifted slowly, carrying reflections of pale morning light. Somewhere beyond, the north buoy bobbed silently, steady and deliberate. She could imagine the Marabelle, drifting long ago, carried gently by the current, unseen and patient. Along the edge of the harbor, an old fishing shed leaned to one side. Lena entered quietly. Inside, the floorboards creaked underfoot. A faint trail of footprints in dust led toward a back wall. There, a small hatch led to a hidden crawl space. She opened it carefully, revealing a cramped area filled with notebooks, charts, and small instruments. Tides, winds, and current patterns were noted meticulously. Some of the pages were recent, suggesting ongoing observation, continuing a rhythm begun decades before. Outside, gulls circled lazily above the docks. The water lapped against pilings, soft and steady. Lena stepped back onto the pier, watching as the buoy rocked slowly with the tide, an enduring marker of something carried, unseen, over years. A distant lighthouse cast a sweeping beam across the water, faint and deliberate, touching the edges of the harbor with calm arcs of light. She moved along a narrow trail between the cliffs, passing scattered rocks and small shrubs, each step soft and deliberate. On a secluded beach below, remnants of driftwood were scattered along the sand. Some pieces were arranged in patterns, subtle, almost imperceptible. Among the wood, Lena noticed faint markings scratched into the sand, lines and shapes that seemed to point toward the buoy. The tide would wash them away slowly, leaving only hints of something quietly observed. She lingered, listening to the soft rhythm of waves, wind, and distant gulls. The air carried the faint smell of salt and pine, blending with the slow, deliberate breathing of the ocean. A small inlet nearby held a forgotten dock, rotting slightly at the edges. She stepped onto it, the boards creaking softly, and watched as tiny ripples formed where water met wood. Even here, far from the town, the north buoy remained visible in the distance, steady, patient, and persistent. Every sound, the distant lapping of water, the whispering of the wind through rocks and trees, The faint creak of old wood seemed to mark the passage of time in a deliberate, careful rhythm. And Lena realized that each quiet path, each forgotten structure, and each subtle observation was part of a slow, patient story still unfolding, carried gently by the tide and the wind. Lena left the inlet slowly, walking along a narrow dirt path that hugged the cliffs. Tall grasses brushed her arms, and the air smelled faintly of brine and earth. The ocean below moved quietly, almost imperceptibly, carrying the soft sound of water against stone. The path led into a small grove of birch and spruce. Sunlight filtered in thin shafts, illuminating patches of moss and fallen needles. In the center of the grove, she found a tiny cabin, nearly hidden beneath low branches. The door was slightly ajar, creaking with the wind. Inside, the cabin was nearly empty, save for a small wooden table and a chair. On the table lay a single notebook, its cover worn smooth. The pages inside were filled with careful sketches of the coastline, marks of tides, and notes in a handwriting deliberate and slow. Small arrows pointed to the north buoy and several other spots along the edge of the reefs. Some notes were dated decades ago, others appeared much more recent. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rustling leaves and moving shadows across the cabin floor. Continuing along the forest trail, Lena came upon an abandoned ranger cabin. Its walls were gray with age, shingles missing from the roof. A faded sign above the door read, "Observation Station, do not enter." The warning had long been ignored. Inside, she found journals and tide charts, stacked carefully on shelves that sagged under time. Each entry was methodical, noting weather, drift, and light patterns on the water. On a small table by the window, a pair of binoculars rested, lenses fogged slightly with moisture. They were angled toward the north buoy. Further along the coast, a narrow road led into a quiet valley. Mist clung to the low-lying fields, softening the outlines of scattered farmhouses. One farmhouse stood closer to the water, with peeling white paint and a small dock jutting into a tidal inlet. Lena approached the dock slowly. The boards creaked underfoot. A rowboat tied loosely swayed gently with the tide. Inside the boat, she noticed a bundle of letters tied with twine. The ink was faded, the handwriting careful and precise. The letters described small observations of the buoy over the years, recorded almost daily. A soft wind carried the scent of wet wood and salt water. The only other sounds were distant gulls and the gentle lapping of the tide. A quiet trail led from the farmhouse into a pine forest. Lena followed it, the soft needles underfoot muffling each step. The forest opened into a small clearing where an old boathouse leaned to one side. Inside, a row of small wooden models of boats rested on shelves. Each boat was labeled with a date and location. Some matched old maps she had seen. Others corresponded to places she did not recognize. A faint trail led from the boathouse toward a hidden inlet. Lena followed it slowly. The inlet was calm, water dark and reflective, almost glass-like. Small reeds swayed gently at its edges. A wooden pier extended into the water, rotted slightly at the edges. A notebook lay atop one of the posts, pages fluttering softly in the breeze. Inside, detailed notes recorded the position of the Maribel, currents, and lights observed near the north buoy. Each observation was dated carefully, some decades old, some startlingly recent. Lena moved back through the forest, following a narrow trail that led toward an old, abandoned lighthouse perched on a rocky promontory. The lighthouse towered quietly, white paint chipped, windows streaked with salt and time. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, spiral stairs led to a small platform. A single telescope pointed outward, aimed toward the distant buoy. Dust-covered ledgers were stacked near the railing. They contained meticulous observations of drift patterns, tides, and small anomalies noted over many years. The wind moved through the tower, soft and steady, carrying the smell of sea and stone. Descending slowly, Lena noticed a small trapdoor in the floor. Beneath it lay a hidden room. The room was small, lined with shelves of maps, journals, and tiny wooden models of the Maribel and other boats. Each item was arranged with care, some pieces clearly decades old, others freshly crafted. Outside, waves moved gently against the cliffs, sunlight glinting on the water's surface in calm, slow arcs. A narrow path led from the lighthouse toward the forest, winding through ferns and low shrubs. Near the path, a forgotten shack leaned against a rocky outcrop. Inside, a series of notebooks recorded observations of lights, floating shapes, and tides near the North Buoy. Some pages described times of day, wind patterns, and subtle currents, noted in small, careful handwriting. Further along, Lena discovered a small wooden dock hidden beneath overhanging trees. A rowboat rested tied to a post, water lapping quietly at its edges. On the floor of the boat, she found a small, sealed bottle with a note inside. The note contained only a single sentence, written in careful script. The drift continues, unseen, as always. The harbor beyond remained calm, sunlight glinting off the pilings. The North Buoy swayed slowly with the tide, distant and steady. Lena paused at the edge of the dock, listening to the soft rhythm of water, wind, and distant gulls. The forest, the cliffs, the abandoned structures, all seemed to hold their breath, waiting, observing. And the mystery, patient and deliberate, drifted quietly across the water, carrying decades of careful observation, unseen patterns, and secrets that had yet to reveal themselves. Lena left the dock and followed a narrow, overgrown path that wound through low coastal shrubs. The path led to a quiet meadow, where wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze. A faint trail of footprints, soft, almost imperceptible, led toward a small stand of spruce trees. Among the trees, she found a stone structure, partially hidden under moss and ivy. Its walls were low and crumbling, but inside, the air smelled faintly of salt and old timber. A wooden crate sat in the center, filled with yellowed envelopes and folded maps. Each envelope was labeled with a year and a date. The maps showed subtle variations in tide patterns and coastal currents, with tiny notations in the margins, times, angles, and faint symbols she had not seen before. She lingered in the quiet, listening to the distant sound of water moving over stones, the whisper of wind through pine needles, and the slow call of a lone gull far offshore. Continuing along the coast, Lena reached a narrow inlet where a long-abandoned boathouse leaned toward the water. The structure's door had rotted away entirely, leaving a gaping entrance. Inside, dust lay thick across the floor, but careful arrangements of bottles and small wooden stakes suggested someone had been here not too long ago. Among the debris, she found a small notebook. Its pages detailed the daily movements of a single boat, circled repeatedly on charts near the North Buoy. The handwriting was precise, slow, and meticulous, as though whoever had written it had spent hours observing the water without ever leaving the boathouse. She stepped outside, the sun low on the horizon, casting a gentle amber glow across the water. A thin trail led from the boathouse into a quiet forest. Pine needles cushioned her footsteps as she followed it, the air fragrant with resin and damp earth. In a small clearing, she found an old ranger's watchtower, long and used but still standing firm among the trees. Inside, spiral stairs led to a small observation platform. The wooden floorboards groaned softly as she moved. From the platform, the north buoy was visible, tiny and steady in the distance. A stack of weathered logbooks rested on a shelf. Each contained notes on drift patterns, tide observations, and faint sketches of boats. Some entries were decades old, others surprisingly recent, suggesting a continuity of observation stretching over many years. Descending the tower, Lena followed another trail that led to a narrow gravel road. The road wound between fields of tall grass, leading to a small lakeside cabin nestled among birch and alder. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, though the place appeared otherwise deserted. Inside, she found journals filled with quiet observations, water movement, shifting shadows, and subtle reflections on the northern coast. One notebook contained faint sketches of shapes floating near the north buoy, circles and lines drawn carefully, almost imperceptibly. Outside, the lake water shimmered gently in the soft light, each ripple slow and deliberate. A small wooden dock extended into the water, creaking softly under her weight. She noticed a rowboat tied loosely, its edges frayed from years of use. A single notebook rested inside, open to a page describing the drift of objects far offshore. Continuing along the shoreline, Lena came to a hidden cove, sheltered by rocky cliffs. An old stone shed stood near the water's edge, half collapsed and covered in ivy. Inside, she found bottles and jars lined on shelves, each containing sand, water, or small bits of driftwood. Faint labels indicated dates spanning decades, some recent, some old enough to be yellowed and brittle. She moved on, following a trail that led through a quiet forest to a small, forgotten dock along a tidal inlet. A wooden pier stretched into the water, boards worn and softened by age. A single notebook lay atop a piling, filled with precise notations of currents, times, and drift directions. The north buoy remained visible in the distance, swaying gently, calm and unhurried. Lena paused, listening to the slow rhythm of the waves, the whispering of the wind through trees, and the faint creak of old wood beneath her feet. A faint trail from the dock led into a dense forest, where an abandoned cabin rested in shadow. Inside, journals and charts covered a small table. Some pages were covered in faint sketches of shapes on the water, subtle curves and circles drawn with quiet care. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and salt, blending with the gentle lapping of water against stone. A narrow footpath led further along the coastline, past small cliffs and quiet meadows, toward a solitary shack built against a rocky outcrop. The shack's interior was lined with maps, notebooks, and wooden models of boats. Some models were simple, others detailed, showing rigging, hull shapes, and tiny notations about drift. She lingered, listening to the soft rhythm of water, wind, and distant gulls. Every sound, the gentle slap of waves, the rustle of leaves, the faint creak of boards, marked time with quiet deliberation. And somewhere in the distance, the north buoy continued to drift slowly, patiently, carrying whispers of the Maribel and decades of careful observation across the still water. Lena continued along the rocky shoreline, stepping carefully over smooth stones slick with dew. The water was calm, pale in the early morning light, and the distant north buoy shimmered faintly on the horizon. A narrow dirt road led inland, winding between low hills overgrown with grass and scattered wildflowers. Halfway along, she noticed a small building tucked into the slope, a former fisheries inspection station, abandoned but intact. Inside, shelves were lined with ledgers, each filled with brief notes on catches, tides, and occasional observations of lights or shapes offshore. One ledger, more recent than the others, contained careful sketches of drifting vessels and subtle notations near the buoy. The handwriting was deliberate, slow, almost meditative, as though the author had spent hours watching the water in silence. From the station, a faint path led into a dense grove of spruce and cedar. The forest floor was soft with fallen needles. Sunlight filtered in gentle shafts, illuminating patches of moss and tiny ferns. In the center of the grove, she discovered a small cabin, almost hidden beneath low branches. Its door hung loosely on old hinges. Inside, a single table held stacks of notebooks and small jars filled with sand, salt water, and tiny pebbles. Each jar was labeled with dates, some decades old, some surprisingly recent. The notebooks contained sketches of waves, currents, and faint shapes near the north buoy. Small arrows marked movement and drift. Outside, a narrow trail continued along the edge of a small lake. The water was still, mirror-like, reflecting clouds that drifted lazily across the sky. A wooden dock extended into the lake, weathered and soft underfoot. A rowboat rested at the end, gently rocking with the tide. Inside the boat, Lena found a bundle of letters tied with twine. The ink was faded, the handwriting careful and precise. The letters described quiet observations, the movement of the buoy, drifting debris, and faint lights on foggy nights. She followed a thin trail leading from the dock into a quiet forest, where pine trees rose tall and straight, their needles whispering softly in the breeze. In a small clearing, an old stone shed leaned against a rocky outcrop. Inside, notebooks and maps were stacked neatly on a rickety shelf. Each page contained meticulous notes on drift patterns, subtle currents, and observations of shapes moving across the water. A small window framed a view of the north buoy, bobbing steadily in the distance. Continuing through the forest, Lena reached a narrow road lined with moss-covered stone walls. At the end of the road, a forgotten cottage rested against the hillside. The roof sagged slightly, windows dark and quiet. Inside, she found journals filled with faint sketches of the coastline, careful notations of tides, and small symbols whose meaning was not immediately clear. A trapdoor led to a small basement, where dozens of models of boats were arranged on shelves. Each model was labeled with dates and locations, some matching entries in the journals, others suggesting unrecorded observations. Outside, the air was cool and still. The soft rustle of leaves mingled with the gentle lapping of water against the distant shore. A thin trail led from the cottage toward a hidden cove. The cove was quiet, water dark and still, bordered by rocks and low shrubs. A small wooden pier extended into the water. On it rested a notebook, open to a page filled with careful notations of tides, drift, and faint sketches of the Maribel. The north buoy remained visible in the distance, swaying slowly, calm and deliberate. From the pier, a faint path led inland to another abandoned cabin, hidden among birch and spruce. Inside, journals and maps were scattered across a small table. Some pages detailed subtle movements of objects in the water, circles and lines drawn with quiet care. Other pages contained notes on weather, wind, and faint lights observed near the buoy over many years. A soft wind carried the scent of salt and pine through the open windows, mingling with the gentle rhythm of the water. Following the path further, Lena came to a long-forgotten ranger station, its walls gray with age and moss creeping along the roof. Inside, ledgers and notebooks were arranged neatly, each containing careful observations of tides, currents, and the buoy's slow, patient drift. Outside, gulls called softly, and waves lapped gently against distant rocks. A narrow trail from the station led through low hills, past scattered boulders and small patches of wildflowers. At the trail's end, she found a small dock, partially collapsed but still standing. A rowboat rested tied loosely, rocking gently with the tide. Inside, a notebook contained delicate sketches and careful notes of drift patterns near the buoy, dating back decades. The north buoy remained in view, steady and deliberate, a faint silhouette against the horizon. The wind whispered through the grass and trees, carrying the sound of distant water and the faint rustle of birds moving through the underbrush. Every structure, trail, and observation seemed part of a slow, patient rhythm, quietly marking time and preserving the careful attention of those who had watched the drift over many years. Lena lingered at the dock, listening to the soft, steady pulse of the ocean, the gentle creak of wood, and the whisper of wind through leaves. And beyond, the north buoy continued its slow oscillation, carrying secrets and memories across the calm, unhurried water. Lena stepped off the dock, letting the soft rhythm of the waves guide her steps along a narrow path that led into a grove of cedar and spruce. The forest smelled of damp earth and resin, the soft undergrowth muffling each footfall. Shafts of morning light filtered through the tall trees, illuminating patches of moss and tiny wildflowers. A thin trail led to a small clearing where a forgotten cabin sat, its roof covered in moss, paint faded to a soft gray. Inside, a single table held several journals and a wooden box filled with faded photographs. The photos showed small boats, some partially obscured by fog, drifting near the north buoy over many years. The edges of the photographs were curled, soft, and worn. Alongside the photos, Lena found a stack of letters tied with twine. Each letter described slow observations of the water, tides, and drifting lights that were never fully explained. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. A flock of birds rose quietly from the underbrush, moving in soft arcs above the canopy. Following a narrow trail from the cabin, Lena reached a small, abandoned ranger station perched on a rocky hillside. The building leaned slightly, wood creaking faintly in the breeze. Inside, shelves were filled with old tide charts, notebooks, and a single telescope pointing toward the north buoy. A stack of logs contained observations recorded over decades, subtle currents, floating debris, and occasional faint lights on foggy nights. She left the station and walked along a quiet road that curved inland, flanked by tall grass and wildflowers. A small lakeside cabin appeared, tucked among birch trees. Smoke rose slowly from the chimney, though the cabin appeared otherwise empty. Inside, notebooks and journals were stacked carefully on a table. Pages contained detailed sketches of boats, tides, and currents. One page described a drift pattern near the north buoy that seemed to repeat seasonally, year after year, like a quiet pulse beneath the calm surface of the water. A narrow trail led from the cabin down to the lake, where a small dock extended into still water. A rowboat rested at the end, tied loosely. Inside, A notebook contained careful notes of the Maribel's disappearance, drift patterns, and subtle observations of lights and shapes seen on foggy nights. Beyond the lake, a winding forest path led to an old, crumbling stone shed. Inside, small jars filled with sand, water, and driftwood lined the shelves. Each jar was labeled with dates spanning decades, some recent, some long faded. Nearby, a narrow trail led to a hidden inlet, where a long-forgotten wooden pier stretched into calm water. On the pier, a notebook rested atop a piling, filled with precise notes of tides, drift, and faint sketches of objects floating near the north buoy. From the pier, a forest trail wound uphill to a secluded cliffside cabin. Inside, journals covered a small table. Pages were filled with delicate sketches of shapes on the water, faint circles, and lines drawn with careful attention. Outside, the wind carried the scent of salt and pine, mingling with the soft rhythm of water against rocks below. A narrow footpath led from the cabin along the cliffs to a small, abandoned fishing shed. Inside, notebooks and maps detailed the careful observation of drift, tides, and the subtle movements of the Maribel. A small trapdoor in the floor led to a hidden space, lined with miniature models of boats and tiny markers indicating positions near the buoy. Lena continued along the cliffside trail, passing scattered boulders and patches of wildflowers. At the end, she found a small pier leading to a hidden cove. The cove was calm, water dark and still, bordered by low shrubs and rocks. A wooden dock jutted into the water. A rowboat rested at its edge, gently rocking with the tide. Inside the boat, she found a notebook, open to a page filled with careful sketches of drift patterns and subtle currents, some dating back decades. The north buoy remained visible in the distance, swaying gently with the tide. The forest beyond rustled softly, leaves brushing together in slow arcs. A narrow trail led from the cove inland, where another abandoned cabin rested in shadow, nearly hidden by spruce and cedar. Inside, journals and maps were scattered across a small table, filled with meticulous observations of tides, currents, and floating shapes near the buoy. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the calm, steady rhythm of water, the gentle creak of boards, and the faint call of distant gulls. Every place Lena visited seemed to hold a quiet memory, a deliberate record of time and observation. The north buoy continued its slow, patient drift across the water, carrying decades of unnoticed movements and subtle patterns. And beyond the horizon, the ocean stretched silently, unhurried, holding its secrets with calm persistence. Lena lingered at the edge of the cove, watching the north buoy sway gently with the tide. She unfolded the notebook she had found in the rowboat, tracing the careful sketches of currents and drift patterns. The more she compared the different journals and sketches from the cabins, the more a quiet pattern began to emerge. The drift, the floating shapes, the recurring circles in the water, all of it moved with the tides in a slow, predictable rhythm. It seemed that the Maribel had not disappeared in haste or disaster. Instead, it appeared to have been carried far from the harbor by the slow, patient movement of water and wind, guided by currents that only someone watching for years could have traced. The notes about faint lights, shadows, and drifting shapes suddenly made sense. They were not mysterious apparitions. They were observations of the boat itself, carried by subtle currents, sometimes obscured by fog or low light. Even the repeated visits to cabins and sheds by unknown observers suggested one thing. Someone had been quietly monitoring the drift for decades, charting the slow path of the Maribel. Lena walked along the shoreline, feeling the gentle pulse of the ocean beneath her feet. She realized that Thomas Bell had likely left small clues behind intentionally, not out of fear, but as part of his careful study of the water. The white page found in the harbor archive, the note about drifting past the buoy, was simply the latest in a long line of patient observations. It was a message meant not to alarm, but to mark the continuity of something moving quietly across the water. Later, Lena visited the small lakeside cabin again, tracing the paths noted in journals and letters. She mapped them slowly, watching as the routes converged in the same region past the North Buoy. The pieces fell into place. The Maribel had drifted past the shallow reef, following the tides and currents that Thomas had tracked. It had not vanished abruptly. It had merged into the quiet rhythm of the sea, continuing to move in harmony with the water, unobserved, unhurried. Each cabin, each journal, each carefully drawn model was a record of patient attention, quietly noting what the unobservant eye would miss. The town of Alder Cove, the abandoned docks, the hidden boathouses, they had all played a part in holding the memory of those movements. Lena sat quietly on a small pier, listening to the gentle swish of waves and the faint cry of distant gulls. It felt as though the water itself was breathing, marking time with slow, steady patience. In that rhythm, she understood, the mystery was not dramatic or violent. It was a quiet convergence of observation, patience, and the steady persistence of the natural world. The Maribel had become part of the tide, its course charted by a single, careful observer, now reflected across decades of meticulous notes. And Thomas Bell's presence lingered not as a ghost or a tragedy, but as a quiet, thoughtful record left in harmony with the water he had known so well. Lena traced her fingers over the pages of a journal once more, reading the small, deliberate notations. It was clear now, the disappearance had never been sudden. It had been a slow, deliberate merging of vessel, tide, and observation. She rose from the pier and looked toward the North Buoy. Its gentle, rhythmic sway seemed to echo the calm understanding she felt settling over the town. The patterns that had once seemed mysterious were now quiet truths. Drift, tide, and careful attention, carrying the Maribel farther than anyone had realized, yet never truly lost. Walking back through the quiet forest trails toward Alder Cove, Lena felt the slow pulse of the water beneath the distant horizon. The mystery had not ended with noise or confrontation. It had resolved itself gently, naturally, in the patient movements of the ocean and the careful eyes of a man who had watched it all along. And as she returned to the town, the streets calm in the fading light, every dock, every cabin, every shaded trail seemed to carry a soft echo of that quiet truth, that some mysteries are not solved in sudden revelation, but in patient observation, reflection, and the steady rhythm of the world itself. The North Buoy continued its gentle sway, carrying the memory of the Maribel, the meticulous attention of Thomas Bell, and the quiet understanding Lena now held across the unhurried, endless water. Case 2. The first note arrived in the mailbox of the small post office before dawn. It was simply folded, sealed with a neat crease, and bore no return address. Inside, in delicate, almost hesitant handwriting, were 3 words, "Look beneath stones." The words felt heavier than paper, as if they carried a quiet insistence that something long hidden was waiting. The town of Hollow Creek was still asleep when the local deputy, a man named Lyle, found the note on the counter. Outside, Fog lay thick across the narrow streets, muffling the edges of the old buildings. A few street lamps glimmered dimly, their light blurred and softened by the mist, creating pools of muted gold on the pavement. Lyle pocketed the note and walked toward the riverbank where the creek curved gently, the water moving with a slow, lapping rhythm that seemed endless. He paused beside a cluster of mossy stones near the water's edge. They were slick from the morning dew, green in patches and dark with age. He knelt and touched one, noting a faint warmth beneath the surface that didn't belong to the cold spring air. No one else was awake yet. A heron lifted silently from the far side of the creek, wings folding without a sound. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and pine needles from the nearby forest. Lyle moved another stone and found a small metal box, rusted at the edges. Inside, there were fragments of photographs, black and white, yellowed with time. Faces stared back at him. People he did not recognize, frozen in soft smiles that seemed quiet but insistent, like the town itself was holding its breath. By late morning, the fog had thinned into a pale haze, sunlight sliding across the worn boards of the old dock. Lyle returned with the sheriff, a tall, slow-moving woman named Grace, who wore her hair pulled back tight and carried a notebook filled with neat observations. Together, they traced the origins of the photographs to a shuttered cabin near the edge of the forest, one that appeared to have been abandoned decades earlier. The door creaked faintly as it opened, revealing a dust-heavy air and shelves lined with jars of preserved herbs. A small rocking chair sat in the corner, its paint flaking quietly, as if it had not moved for years. Outside the cabin, the forest pressed close, pine needles carpeting the ground in a thick, cushioned layer. The sun fell in long, slanted lines through the trees, and the occasional breeze made them sway, their whispers indistinct yet constant. Grace knelt by the roots of a large cedar, brushing away soil, and found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The ink had faded to a soft brown, and the words spoke of ordinary life, small-town routines, the slow passage of seasons. But beneath the simplicity, a thread of unease ran, subtle and almost imperceptible. They walked along the trail that followed the ridge of the hill overlooking the creek. The path was narrow, flanked by ferns that dipped their fronds into the mist that still clung to the valley below. Somewhere off to the left, an old greenhouse sagged beneath the weight of years. Inside, shattered glass reflected dim light, and an overgrowth of vines curled around the frames like quiet fingers. Among the vines, they found a notebook with pages of sketches, maps of the town and its outskirts, marks indicating places where stones were piled, trails began, or water ran quietly into the night. One afternoon, they stopped at a small diner on the outskirts of town. The place smelled of coffee and toasted bread, the air humming softly from the old refrigerator. A waitress named Millie spoke quietly of a man who used to walk the hills at dusk, carrying a small satchel. She remembered his gait, the way he would pause by certain trees, sometimes speaking to no one. Her voice was calm, almost dreamy, like a memory unfolding in slow motion. Lyle and Grace returned to the creek one evening, when the sun had dipped behind the hills, spilling pink and amber across the water. They examined a cluster of stones arranged as if deliberately, each one smoothed by years of weather. Beneath them, they found fragments of wood, faintly carved with symbols that were undecipherable but deliberate. The patterns felt familiar, echoing shapes from the sketches in the greenhouse notebook. Days passed quietly. Rain fell in gentle sheets, drumming softly on the roofs of Hollow Creek. In the softened light of dawn, the investigators wandered through an abandoned orchard at the edge of town, the trees skeletal yet dignified. In the soil beneath one ancient apple tree, they discovered a shallow cavity lined with bricks. Inside, small, delicate objects rested. Buttons, coins, trinkets, items that spoke of lives once present and quietly forgotten. Evenings were spent along the shoreline, where the creek met the larger river. Mist rose in layers, blurring the boundary between land and water. Lyle noticed a pattern in the placement of certain stones along the bank, their arrangement almost ritualistic, and Grace recorded everything meticulously, her pencil scratching softly against paper. The gentle lapping of water against stones became a rhythm, a quiet heartbeat beneath their discoveries. In a cleared patch of the forest, they found remnants of a fire pit, carefully built, now cold and mossed over. Scattered around it were shards of pottery and fragments of letters. They read the words slowly, aloud at times, letting the soft syllables echo through the trees. The letters spoke of waiting, of watching, of noticing the small changes in the forest over long stretches of time. One misty afternoon, they visited the old train station at the edge of town, long unused but preserved in weathered wood. The tracks stretched into fog, disappearing into the hills. Inside the station, a ledger lay open on a ledge, dusted and gray. It contained records of arrivals and departures, but also marginal notes, observations of travelers, of townsfolk, of the quiet routines that seemed normal but were now seen in the light of the investigation as deliberate, almost secretive. They returned frequently to the cabin at the forest edge. Each time, the air smelled of moss and decaying leaves, of soil turned and the faint scent of old paper. In one corner, behind a false panel, they discovered a small wooden box filled with coins from decades past. Each coin was carefully cleaned and stacked, as if someone had been maintaining them quietly, over time, waiting. At night, when the fog rolled down from the hills, Lyle and Grace would sit by the riverbank with nothing but the sound of water and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. They talked softly about the things they had seen, the stones, the letters, the photographs, and began to recognize subtle connections, patterns in placement, repetition in timing, choices that hinted at intention without ever revealing full explanation. The forest seemed to respond to their presence, the wind through the trees softening, the undergrowth shifting slightly. In a small clearing, they found an old shed, the wood darkened by rain. Inside, a pile of notebooks leaned against the wall. Each one was filled with observations, sketches, careful records of movement, of birds, of people, of light passing through the trees. The handwriting varied slightly, but there was a common meticulousness, a steady patience reflected in every line. Walking along a quiet lane one morning, they noticed an abandoned stone well covered in moss. Its depth was impossible to gauge in the dim light, and at its edge rested a single lantern, unlit as if waiting. Beneath the stones that framed the well, they discovered fragments of journals, edges soft with age, documenting hours spent watching the creek, the fields, the town itself. In a forgotten barn at the outskirts, the scent of hay mixed with damp wood. Inside, old crates held carved figurines, tiny in size, each painted with faded colors. Some were carefully broken, others pristine. The arrangement seemed deliberate, a silent order among the disarray. Grace noted that the positions mirrored some of the sketches they had seen in the cabin, as if the forest, the creek, and the barn were all components of a single quiet map. On the hills above Hollow Creek, they found a series of stone cairns, each stacked with deliberate care. From one cairn to another, the spacing and alignment suggested an intention beyond random placement. Lal traced a finger along the top stones, feeling the subtle differences in texture, the tiny scratches that hinted at human hands rather than nature. The fog rolling through the hills softened the world around them, making every movement and discovery feel suspended in time. By the river where driftwood gathered, they uncovered small containers hidden beneath roots. Each held a folded scrap of paper, inscriptions of names, dates, and brief observations. The entries were simple, understated, yet collectively they whispered of someone methodically recording life, of marking existence in quiet, careful increments. They ventured to a deserted mill on the edge of town, its wheel long stopped. The boards beneath their feet creaked lightly, echoing in the empty structure. Inside, scattered journals and bundles of letters spoke of a presence that had observed, quietly and continuously, the movements of people and seasons, of the creek, the forest, and the town. Each entry carried the same deliberate calm, noting changes, patterns, and small anomalies that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Walking back through the misty forest, the quiet was profound. The only sounds were the soft crunch of needles underfoot, the distant water, and their own deliberate breathing. Each discovery, each note, each stone carefully turned seemed to extend a conversation with someone long gone, someone who had quietly, patiently, mapped the town and its edges with meticulous care. They returned to the creek as the sun lowered, painting the mist in soft shades of amber and rose. Along the bank, stones, moss, and driftwood created a subtle, almost imperceptible pattern. Grace traced it slowly with her finger, noting how it mirrored a sketch from the cabin notebook. It was neither grand nor loud, yet it carried a resonance that filled the quiet evening air. Near the edge of the forest, they came upon a grove of young trees, evenly spaced, their branches swaying lightly. At the base of one, a shallow pit held a collection of small objects, buttons, trinkets, a single coin, and a folded piece of paper. The writing was faint, the edges frayed, but it spoke with the same calm precision that had echoed throughout the cabins, barns, wells, and cairns they had explored. At the old bridge that spanned the creek, the boards creaked softly underfoot. Beneath the water, shapes of stones worn smooth over decades created quiet, shifting currents. In the shadows at the far end, they noticed an outline of what might have been a marker, hidden partially under mud and silt. Removing it revealed a small metal plate engraved with a single, cryptic word, polished faintly by years of water and time. In the orchard at the edge of the forest, the skeletal trees shifted with the soft breeze. Beneath the roots of a particularly gnarled apple tree, they uncovered a bundle of letters tied in faded ribbon, older than any of the previous discoveries. The ink was soft, faded, and the words spoke of waiting, of observing, of noticing every small change in the world around. Returning to the riverbank at dusk, the water shimmered softly, reflecting the final light of the day. Stones were shifted, driftwood arranged subtly, letters and trinkets tucked carefully beneath roots. Lyle and Grace moved slowly among them, tracing each placement, recording each observation, feeling the quiet insistence of the mystery unfold. The mist rose again, gentle and thick, blurring edges and softening shapes. The town lay in silence behind them, the creek murmuring low and constant. Each discovery seemed to echo into the next, a continuous thread winding through the forest, the cabins, the stones, the journals, the letters, and the river itself. Beneath the fading light, Lal paused, touching a stone he had moved earlier. It was cold, damp, but beneath it, something shifted imperceptibly. Grace knelt beside him, lifting another stone slowly, revealing a small, smooth object, its purpose unclear, yet deliberate. It carried the same quiet weight as the note that had begun it all. Look beneath stones. The forest breathed around them, whined through the pines, the distant lapping of the creek, the soft rustle of leaves. Every path they had walked, every stone, every note, every journal entry seemed to settle into place, though still incomplete, whispering quietly, patiently, of a story that was still being revealed. The sun slipped entirely behind the hills, and the world softened further into evening. Mist thickened along the creek, cloaking the water and banks in a gentle haze. Lyle and Grace remained, carefully observing, moving stones, reading the faint inscriptions, noticing the faint patterns that suggested intention across time and place. At the edge of the orchard, where shadows pooled beneath the skeletal trees, they found another shallow cavity. Inside, a collection of small wooden objects, carved and arranged in subtle patterns, reflected a meticulous attention to placement. The shapes were abstract, but there was order in their arrangement, a quiet message that could not yet be fully understood. Evening stretched on, long and calm, as they continued to trace the connections among stones, letters, photographs, and wooden carvings. Each discovery felt like a small step, a quiet unfolding of someone's careful attention, stretching across years, blending the lives of those long gone with the present. The air was still, cool, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and moss. The forest seemed to hold its breath, listening alongside them. Lyle brushed away debris from a stone that had long been hidden beneath layers of soil, revealing markings faint but deliberate, almost imperceptible in the dim light. By the creek's edge, they noticed small patterns forming among driftwood and stones, subtle repetitions, as if someone had been arranging them over time, leaving a trail only for those patient enough to notice. Grace sketched each arrangement carefully, her pencil scratching softly against paper, capturing every nuance. A small lantern, long unlit, rested beside an old tree trunk. Its glass was dusty, its metal worn, but the position was deliberate, aligned with the stone arrangements along the bank. Beneath it, they found a folded piece of parchment with faint ink marks, too soft to read fully in the dim evening light, yet unmistakably intentional. Near the abandoned mill, boards shifted softly underfoot as they explored the interior. Dust hung in the air like a quiet curtain, softening the edges of the broken windows. Among crates and pallets, they found a set of old photographs, arranged meticulously in a pattern that echoed other discoveries, subtle yet precise, a gentle choreography of memory and observation. The river murmured endlessly, flowing past the banks where stones and driftwood rested. Mist rose in slow, curling wisps, shrouding the town, the forest, and the creek in a soft, enveloping quiet. Each note, each stone, each discovery seemed connected, forming a chain that stretched beyond the day, beyond the present moment, lingering patiently in the cool evening air. In the orchard once more, they found remnants of an old path, nearly erased by time and undergrowth. Stones were embedded at regular intervals, moss covering some, others bare and worn smooth by years of weather. Beneath one, A small, flat object rested, polished faintly as if touched repeatedly. By the creek, where driftwood gathered and moss clung to stones, they uncovered yet another letter, edges softened by damp, ink faded. The words were calm, methodical, noting small changes in light, water, and wind. Every subtle shift observed with patient attention, quietly chronicling life and passage in the forest. Night settled softly over Hollow Creek. The fog thickened, water glimmered in the dim light, and the trees whispered with a slow, steady rhythm. Lyle and Grace moved among the stones, driftwood, journals, and letters, tracing the connections, noting patterns, and feeling the quiet insistence of a story unfolding slowly, deliberately, beneath the surface of the town, the forest, and the creek. The wind shifted through the pines, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and moss. Every stone, journal, photograph, and carved object seemed to pulse softly with quiet intention. They moved slowly, observing, noting, lifting stones, reading letters, feeling the rhythm of the mystery unfold like a soft current beneath the calm night air. Beneath a moss-covered stone at the creek's bend, they found a small carved figure, polished smooth, deliberate in placement. Nearby, driftwood formed a subtle alignment with other stones along the bank. Grace traced the lines gently, her pencil marking the pattern on paper, capturing the quiet narrative of presence, attention, and time stretching across the town, the forest, and the creek itself. Even as darkness deepened, the world remained calm. Mist rolled over the water, softening the shapes of trees and stones. The forest, the creek, and the town seemed to exhale slowly, patiently, as if acknowledging the careful, deliberate observations that had begun with a simple note. Look beneath stones. The soft murmur of water, the gentle sway of trees, the faint rustle of leaves, and the careful placement of objects across the forest floor carried on into the night, each detail a whisper, a small revelation in a mystery that remained patient, methodical, and infinitely quiet. Beneath the canopy of stars, Lyle and Grace continued their quiet exploration, uncovering fragments of letters, stones, photographs, and carved objects. Each discovery built upon the last, forming an intricate lattice of observation, patience, and deliberate attention. The air was cool, the mist thick, and the forest seemed to hold its breath alongside them, suspended in the calm rhythm of the unfolding mystery. Near the old well in the orchard, they found another hidden cavity, carefully dug, containing a collection of small, worn objects. Buttons, coins, and trinkets, each arranged in subtle alignment with stones and driftwood nearby. The objects spoke of patience, of someone observing the slow passage of time, quietly recording, arranging, and leaving traces for those willing to notice. Along the creek, where fog hugged the water's edge, stones and driftwood suggested patterns of intention. Lyle traced a sequence with his hand, noting the delicate alignments. Grace sketched the arrangement, her pencil capturing the quiet geometry of a story unfolding over years, in silence, beneath the surface of everyday life. In the forest clearing, an abandoned cabin stood shrouded in mist. Inside, journals and letters lined the shelves, notes of observations spanning decades. Each entry was calm, meticulous, and understated, chronicling small changes in the creek, the forest, and the town. Patterns emerged slowly, subtle and deliberate, connecting stones, driftwood, letters, and carved objects across time and space. At the mill, dust motes danced in the dim light, filtering through broken windows. Boards creaked softly underfoot. Inside, photographs, journals, and small carved figures were arranged in careful order. The objects formed a quiet language of observation, attention, and time, echoing the rhythm of the creek, the forest, and the town beyond. On the hillside overlooking Hollow Creek, a series of stone cairns rose in subtle alignment. Each stone rose slowly from the slope, each stacked carefully atop the next, worn smooth by rain and frost. Lyle and Grace traced the alignment, noting how it seemed to lead toward a cluster of pines at the far edge of the hill. The mist curled among the trees, softening the outlines of the forest beyond, and the scent of damp pine needles hung gently in the air. Following the cairns, they came upon an abandoned ranger station, its wood darkened and warped by years of neglect. The windows were clouded with dust, and the door creaked softly as they pushed it open. Inside, faded maps and ledgers lay scattered across a desk. One map had hand-drawn marks showing small paths winding through the forest, some leading to places Lyle and Grace had already explored, others pointing toward areas they had not yet seen. A thin light filtered through cracks in the roof, illuminating the dust motes floating lazily in the air. On a shelf, a row of old binoculars rested, lenses slightly fogged. Grace lifted one, peering through it toward the distant hills, noticing faint clearings and clusters of rocks that seemed deliberately placed. The patterns were subtle, almost imperceptible from a distance, but they hinted at another layer of intention spread across the landscape. They stepped outside and followed a narrow trail that led downhill, toward a small lake that lay like glass, reflecting the muted colors of late afternoon. The water was still, smooth as polished stone, and only the occasional ripple broke its calm surface. Along the shoreline, Lyle noticed fragments of driftwood arranged in low, quiet lines, almost like markers pointing toward the shallows. At the far end of the lake, a tiny boathouse leaned slightly, weathered gray and quiet. Inside, a single rowboat rested, tied loosely to a post. The floor was scattered with old ropes and a small pile of fishing hooks. Beneath a loose plank, Grace discovered a collection of notes, each describing subtle changes in the lake over time. Water levels, bird movements, reflections of clouds. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, almost meditative in its patience. They left the lake and followed a road that wound through the forest, narrow and bordered by tall pines that absorbed the light. Along the roadside, a small, shuttered general store appeared, long closed, its sign faded and peeling. Inside, the shelves were empty, but a ledger lay open on the counter, chronicling deliveries and small-town events from decades past. One entry noted the arrival of a traveling craftsman who had passed quietly through the town but left behind a pattern of carved wooden figures, much like those they had discovered earlier. Behind the store, a narrow alley led to an overgrown lot where an old garage once stood. Rusted tools and scattered boards were all that remained. Beneath a pile of weathered tarps, Grace found a set of keys tied together with a faded ribbon. Lyle noted their small size, the way they seemed carefully selected rather than discarded. The ribbon was frayed, but the tying had been deliberate, methodical, almost ceremonial in its quiet attention. Further along the forest path, they encountered a small cabin tucked beneath a rise, surrounded by dense ferns and low-hanging branches. The door was ajar, revealing a room filled with faintly scented wood and the soft odor of dried herbs. Inside, a single chair faced the window, angled toward a patch of sunlight that slanted across the floor. On the chair rested a notebook with drawings of the surrounding landscape, each sketch annotated with observations of movement, wind patterns, and subtle shifts in light. From the cabin, a narrow trail led them to a small dock, jutting into a calm pond surrounded by willows. The boards of the dock were smooth with age, and faint scratches suggested frequent use, though no one had been there for many years. Beneath the dock, small stones had been arranged along the edge of the water, some partially submerged, forming delicate patterns that caught the fading light. Lal bent down, tracing the edges with his fingers, feeling the cool smoothness of each stone. Nearby, a forgotten ranger's shed leaned into the slope, doors half closed and warped. Inside, old equipment lay in careful order: coiled ropes, stacked lanterns, a row of notebooks filled with observations of weather and wildlife. Grace noted how each object seemed deliberately placed, as if someone had arranged them not just for utility, but as markers of attention, records of quiet care over long stretches of time. In a glade beyond the shed, wildflowers grew in clusters, interrupted by shallow depressions in the soil. Beneath one, Lyle uncovered a small wooden box, its surface etched with faint symbols. Inside were tiny carved figures, polished and arranged in patterns that mirrored other discoveries in the forest. The subtle repetition suggested an unseen narrative, deliberate and patient, connecting each object and location across the landscape. They moved on along a quiet forest road, where the tall trees formed a canopy that filtered the waning sunlight. On a bend, an abandoned gas station appeared, pumps long rusted and faded. Inside the office, a ledger chronicled the comings and goings of travelers and locals, noting times, dates, and small observations of unusual behavior. A faint pencil sketch at the corner of one page mirrored the arrangements of stones they had seen at the creek and lake. Beyond the gas station, a narrow bridge crossed a shallow stream, water glinting with the last light of day. Along the banks, small markers of driftwood and smooth stones hinted at careful placement. Lyle knelt, lifting one stone to find a hidden envelope containing a single, folded note. Its words were faint, nearly erased by years of moisture, but spoke of watching, recording, and noticing the smallest shifts in nature and life. They followed the stream upstream, where it curved beneath a dense thicket and opened into a hidden pond. The water was dark and quiet, reflecting the dense foliage overhead. Along the edge, submerged branches and stones created subtle alignments. Grace pointed to faint scratches on a submerged log, almost like symbols, delicate and precise. They traced the patterns carefully, feeling the slow, deliberate intelligence behind each arrangement. A trail led from the pond into a thinned section of forest, where an old stone foundation remained, the remnants of a building long forgotten. Beneath the moss-covered stones, Lyle found fragments of a journal, pages soft with age, chronicling the quiet routines of a life spent observing the creek, the lake, and the forest. Each entry was understated, meticulous, almost meditative, noting wind, water, birds, light, and shadows. Near the foundation, a fallen tree created a natural bridge over a small creek. Beneath it, Grace discovered a set of small wooden carvings, arranged with careful spacing. Each figure was unique, yet together they formed a subtle sequence that suggested patterns extending across multiple sites they had visited. The forest seemed to hum softly, the air thick with the quiet patience of time and attention. They continued along a narrow ridge, overlooking Hollow Creek in the distance. The town lay quiet, softened by the evening mist, lights muted and flickering faintly. Along the ridge, scattered stones formed gentle arcs, marking small clearings and paths, each carefully aligned. Lal traced the arcs, noting how they connected distant points: the creek, the cabins, the lake, the dock, the shed, and the abandoned structures beyond. At the edge of the ridge, a forgotten tower stood, made of weathered stone and partially collapsed. Inside, faint sunlight filtered through cracks, illuminating dust and cobwebs. On a ledge, Grace found a series of folded notes, each containing observations of life below: the river, the forest, the roads, the town. The notes were quiet, meticulous, each word chosen with care, documenting the passage of time and the subtle changes in the landscape. Descending from the ridge, they came to a narrow lane lined with abandoned cottages, their windows dark, gardens overgrown. Beneath the roots of one particularly twisted tree, Lal found a small bundle wrapped in fabric. Inside were photographs and letters, carefully preserved despite years of weather and neglect. The images depicted landscapes they had already visited, arranged to emphasize subtle alignments and patterns, echoing other findings throughout the forest and town. A final path led them through a quiet meadow, where the grass swayed gently in the evening breeze. Small stones marked a winding line across the field, partially hidden by the tall grasses. Grace knelt to move one aside, revealing a thin metal plate beneath, polished smooth, bearing faint inscriptions too delicate to read without closer attention. The arrangement suggested care and intention, another quiet thread in the intricate web of observation spread across Hollow Creek and its surrounding lands. The sun disappeared fully behind the hills, leaving only soft twilight. Mist rolled gently across the forest floor, water shimmered faintly in the creek, and the town below exhaled in quiet stillness. Lyle and Grace paused, observing, tracing, and recording, feeling the slow, deliberate patience that had permeated every stone, letter, carving, and note across the landscape. Near the edge of the meadow, beneath a fallen log, they discovered another small wooden box, inside which rested tiny carved figures arranged in delicate sequences. The arrangement mirrored patterns seen at the dock, the ridge, the cabin, and the forest path. Each placement, subtle and deliberate, spoke of a patient, quiet mind attending to the world with meticulous care. They followed a narrow trail into a dense thicket, where the faint light of evening barely penetrated. Along the path, small markers, stones, sticks, and driftwood guided their steps. Beneath one marker, Grace found a folded piece of parchment containing carefully observed sketches of tree branches, creek bends, and stone arrangements. The sketches were precise, understated, yet connected to patterns they had discovered in every location. At the far edge of the forest, they reached an old dock on a quiet inlet, where the water reflected the deepening blue of twilight. Driftwood and stones formed subtle arcs along the shore, aligned with the positions of the cairns on the ridge. Beneath one stone, they found a small envelope containing faint handwritten notes, chronicling observations of tides, wind, birds, and the slow movement of clouds across the sky. From the dock, a narrow trail led to a shuttered cabin, its windows opaque with dust. Inside, a single chair faced a small fireplace, now cold. On the mantel lay a collection of journals, each recording detailed observations of life in Hollow Creek. The creek, the lake, the forest, the roads, the abandoned buildings. The entries were quiet, meticulous, and unhurried, noting changes over time with patient, careful attention. Continuing along the forest edge, they discovered an old boathouse, leaning slightly into the inlet. Inside, a rowboat rested, tied loosely to a post. Beneath the floorboards, Grace found a bundle of letters, each describing subtle shifts in light, weather, and the movement of water. The observations were calm, deliberate, and continuous, reflecting years of attentive presence. By the creek once more, mist hung low, softening stones, driftwood, and roots into gentle shapes. Lyle and Grace moved slowly, lifting stones, reading notes, tracing patterns. The quiet of the night embraced them, the water murmuring softly, whined through the pines, whispering low. Each discovery connected to the next, forming a patient, intricate, and unending map of observation that stretched across Hollow Creek, the forest, and the lands beyond. The night deepened, stars faintly visible through gaps in the trees. Along the creek, stones and driftwood suggested alignments. Beneath each, they found letters, carvings, and small objects, each deliberate in placement, each quietly whispering of someone who had spent decades watching, recording, and arranging. The story continued, unfolding slowly, patiently, in the calm rhythm of the forest, water, and night. A hidden path through the forest led to a forgotten cabin, partially obscured by ferns and moss. Inside, Lal noticed a stack of notebooks on a shelf, the spines worn but intact. The pages contained detailed accounts of life in the town, the forest, and the creek, each observation recorded with meticulous care. Patterns emerged across the notebooks, echoing the arrangements of stones, driftwood, and carvings they had found elsewhere. Beyond the cabin, a narrow lane led to a small, shuttered general store. Inside, ledgers and scrap notes chronicled deliveries, arrivals, and subtle observations of townspeople. A pencil sketch of the creek and surrounding paths echoed the arrangements they had seen along the ridge, the lake, and the dock. Each mark carried the same quiet patience, connecting locations and discoveries into a cohesive, unhurried map of attentive observation. Along a quiet road leading from the store, they found an abandoned garage, its doors warped and partially open. Inside, tools and crates were arranged in careful order, the remnants of years of deliberate placement. Beneath a pile of tarps, Grace uncovered a series of wooden carvings, each polished and arranged to mirror patterns from other sites. The rhythm of placement, subtle yet precise, suggested an ongoing, patient narrative stretching across decades and spaces. The mist thickened around them as they returned toward the creek, the water reflecting the soft glow of distant lights. Stones, driftwood, letters, and carved objects lay along the banks in quiet alignment. Lyle and Grace moved slowly, observing, tracing, and recording, feeling the gentle insistence of a story still unfolding, patient, deliberate, and infinite in its quiet rhythm. The forest breathed softly, whined through the pines, and the gentle murmur of water forming a calm, steady pulse. Every object, note, and stone seemed to respond to their presence, revealing subtle connections across Hollow Creek, the forest, the lake, and the roads that stitched the landscape together. The mystery continued, patient and unhurried, waiting quietly to be understood. Near a small clearing in the woods, they discovered an old stone well, its edge moss-covered and weathered. Beneath a loose stone at its base, Grace found a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, each one meticulously documenting observations of light, water, and movement across the forest. The handwriting was faint but deliberate, forming a calm, meditative record of attention and patience. They moved on toward a narrow stream that curved gently through the forest, lined with stones and driftwood arranged subtly along its banks. Beneath one stone, Lyle uncovered a small carved figure, polished smooth, its form deliberate and quiet. Nearby, a small metal plate bore faint inscriptions, difficult to read, yet clearly intentional. At the edge of the forest, a long-forgotten ranger station leaned into the hillside. Inside, old ledgers, maps, and journals recorded decades of observations, weather, wildlife, movements along the creek, and patterns in the town below. Every page was calm, meticulous, patient, connecting locations across Hollow Creek with subtle, deliberate detail. The path led them to a hidden dock on a quiet inlet, water still, reflecting soft twilight. Driftwood and stones formed gentle arcs, aligned with cairns on distant hills. Beneath one stone, they found an envelope with faint notes, chronicling subtle shifts in the creek, the lake, and the surrounding forest. Each note was precise, careful, and unhurried, part of a larger narrative that stretched across time and space. From the dock, a trail led them to a shuttered cabin, its windows clouded with dust. Inside, a chair faced a cold fireplace. On the mantel, journals recorded life in Hollow Creek. The creek, lake, forest, roads, and abandoned structures. The entries were calm, deliberate, and continuous, noting the passage of time with patient attention. Along the creek once more, mist hung low, softening stones, driftwood, and roots into gentle shapes. Lyle and Grace moved slowly, lifting stones, reading notes, tracing patterns. The quiet of the night embraced them, water murmuring softly, wind whispering low. Each discovery connected to the next, forming a patient, intricate, and unending map of observation that stretched across Hollow Creek, the forest, and lands beyond. The night deepened. Stars glimmered faintly above the tree line. Along the creek, stones and driftwood suggested alignments. Beneath each lay letters, carvings, and small objects, deliberately placed, whispering of someone who had spent decades observing, recording, and arranging. The story unfolded slowly, patiently, in the calm rhythm of forest, water, and night. A hidden trail led to a dense thicket. Along its path, subtle markers of stones, sticks, and driftwood guided their steps. Beneath one, Grace found sketches of tree branches, creek bends, and stone alignments. The patterns mirrored arrangements found across the forest and town, connecting discoveries with quiet intention. At the far edge of the woods, an old dock rested in still water, driftwood, and stones forming arcs along the shoreline. Beneath one stone, they uncovered faint handwritten notes, chronicling tides, wind, birds, and clouds. Each observation was deliberate, patient, and continuous, reflecting years of attentive presence. A short walk brought them to a shuttered cabin, windows opaque with dust. Inside, journals recorded life in Hollow Creek, lake, forest, roads, and abandoned structures. Entries were meticulous, noting changes over time with unhurried attention, echoing patterns found in stones, driftwood, carvings, and letters across the landscape. Through the forest, a narrow path led to a meadow, grass swaying in gentle evening breeze. Stones marked winding lines, partially hidden. Beneath one, a flat metal plate bore faint inscriptions, polished smooth, deliberate. Each placement was part of a larger pattern connecting creek, cabins, lake, and forest paths. Night settled fully over Hollow Creek. Mist rolled gently across forest floor. Stones, driftwood, letters, and carvings lay along banks in alignment. Lyle and Grace moved slowly, observing, lifting stones, reading notes, tracing patterns. Quiet of night embraced them, water murmuring softly, wind whispering low. Each discovery linked to the next, forming an intricate, patient, and unending map of observation across Hollow Creek and surrounding lands. At the edge of the meadow, beneath a fallen log, they discovered a small wooden box. Inside rested tiny carved figures, arranged in delicate sequences. Patterns mirrored earlier discoveries: dock, ridge, cabin, and forest path. Placement subtle yet precise, reflecting patient, quiet attention across decades. The trail led to a dense forest, fading light barely penetrating. Along the path, stones and driftwood marked subtle directions. Beneath one, Grace found a parchment with detailed sketches, tree branches, creek bends, stone alignments. Each sketch precise, understated, yet connected to patterns across locations. At the edge of the forest, they reached a small dock, water calm, reflecting twilight. Driftwood and stones aligned with cairns on distant hills. Beneath one stone, envelope held faint notes chronicling subtle shifts in creek, lake, and forest. Each note precise, careful, unhurried, part of a patient narrative across time and space. From the dock, a trail led to shuttered cabin. Inside, chair-faced cold fireplace. Journals on mantle recorded life in Hollow Creek. Creek, lake, forest, roads, abandoned structures. Entries calm, deliberate, continuous, noting passage of time with patient attention. Along creek, mist hung low, softening. Stones, driftwood, roots. Lyle and Grace moved slowly, lifting stones, reading notes, tracing patterns. Night embraced them, water murmuring, wind whispering. Each discovery connected to next, forming intricate, patient, unending map across Hollow Creek, forest, lands beyond. The stars shone faintly above trees. Stones and driftwood suggested alignments. Beneath each lay letters, carvings, small objects, deliberately placed, whispering of decades of observing, recording, arranging. Story unfolded slowly, patiently, in calm rhythm of forest, water, night. A narrow trail led into dense thicket, subtle markers of stones, sticks, driftwood guiding steps. Beneath one, sketches of tree branches, creek bends, stone alignments, mirroring arrangements across forest, town, connecting discoveries quietly. At edge of woods, old dock, still water, driftwood, stones forming arcs along shore. Beneath stone, faint notes chronicled tides, wind, birds, clouds. Observations deliberate, patient, continuous, reflecting years of attentive presence. A short walk brought shuttered cabin, windows opaque. Inside, journals recorded Hollow Creek life. Creek, lake, forest, roads, abandoned structures. Entries meticulous, noting changes over time, echoing patterns in stones, driftwood, carvings, letters across landscape. The forest whispered around them. Mist hugged the creek. Stones, driftwood, letters, carvings lined banks. Lyle and Grace moved slowly, tracing patterns, lifting stones, reading notes. Calm night embraced them, water murmuring, wind whispering. Each discovery connected, forming patient, intricate, unending narrative across Hollow Creek and surrounding lands. A forgotten hill rose beyond creek, stones laid along path in subtle sequence. Beneath one, Grace found carved figures, polished smooth, deliberately arranged. Lal traced sequence with hand, feeling rhythm of quiet observation spanning decades. The forest held its breath. Leaves swayed gently. Creek murmured low. Mist rolled across the ground, softening stones, driftwood, roots. Each discovery linked to next. Patient, quiet story continued, stretching across Hollow Creek, the forest, the lake, the roads, and the abandoned structures that had long watched over it all. Along a narrow lane, an abandoned schoolhouse appeared, its windows dark, paint flaking. Inside, rows of desks and chalkboards lay untouched, dust thick in soft light. Beneath a desk, Lal found a small bundle of papers, observations of students, weather, creek levels, and forest changes, each meticulously recorded. The handwriting was calm, deliberate, patient. Near the schoolyard, an old playground leaned quietly into the twilight. Faded swings and a rusted slide creaked softly in the wind. Beneath the soil of the sandbox, Grace uncovered small carved objects, arranged in a careful pattern that echoed stone alignments at creek, dock, and ridge. They continued along a forested trail leading toward the outskirts of Hollow Creek. The mist was thick, softening shapes and sounds. Along the trail, faint markers of stones, driftwood, and small carvings guided their path. Beneath one, Lal discovered a folded note with subtle observations. Wind, water, light, shadows, all recorded with quiet, deliberate care. The path opened into a small glade, moonlight spilling across tall grasses. In the center, a circle of stones, smooth and worn, formed a delicate pattern. Grace traced the edges, noting similarity to other arrangements. Dock, creek, lake, ridge. Each placement deliberate, patient, echoing decades of observation across the town, forest, and waterways. From the glade, a narrow trail led to a shuttered cabin on the edge of a pond. Inside, journals chronicled life in Hollow Creek. Creek, lake, forest, roads, abandoned structures. Entries meticulous, noting subtle changes, weather, wildlife, human presence. Patterns across journals mirrored arrangements of stones, driftwood, carved figures, letters across multiple locations. The creek murmured low, mist thick around banks, softening driftwood and stones into gentle shapes. Lyle and Grace moved slowly, observing, lifting stones, reading notes, tracing alignments. Night embraced them, each discovery connected to the next, forming patient, intricate, unending map of observation spanning Hollow Creek, forest, lake, roads, and abandoned structures. A hidden trail led further into dense woods. Small markers of stones, sticks, and driftwood guided their steps. Beneath one, Grace found sketches of tree branches, creek bends, stone alignments, echoing patterns discovered elsewhere. Each sketch deliberate, calm, patient, linking discoveries across forest and town. At the edge of the woods, a forgotten dock rested in still water. Driftwood and stones formed subtle arcs along the shoreline. Beneath one stone, envelope contained faint notes chronicling tides, wind, birds, clouds. Observations deliberate, patient, continuous, reflecting decades of attentive presence. A short trail led to a shuttered cabin. Chair-faced cold fireplace. Journals on mantle recorded life in Hollow Creek. Creek, lake, forest, roads, abandoned structures. Entries calm, meticulous, continuous, noting passage of time with patient attention. Along creek, mist hung low, softening stones, driftwood, roots. Lyle and Grace moved slowly, lifting stones, reading notes, tracing patterns. Night embraced them, water murmuring, wind whispering. Each discovery linked to next, forming intricate, patient, unending map of observation across Hollow Creek, forest, lands beyond. At the meadow's edge, beneath a fallen log, small wooden box contained tiny carved figures arranged in delicate sequences. Patterns mirrored previous discoveries: dock, ridge, cabin, forest path. Placement subtle yet precise, reflecting patient, quiet attention across decades. The forest breathed around them, mist curling softly, wind through pines whispering low. Creek murmured endlessly. Stones, driftwood, letters, carvings stretched across Hollow Creek, forest, lake, roads, abandoned structures. Each detail whispered of careful observation, deliberate placement, patience extending across time. The night was calm, deep, soft. Lyle and Grace moved among stones, driftwood, letters, carvings, tracing patterns, lifting objects, recording alignments. Each discovery connected to next, forming quiet, patient, unending narrative that stretched across Hollow Creek, the forest, the lake, the roads, and the abandoned structures beyond. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and moss. Mist hugged the creek, softening shapes. Stars glimmered faintly above tree line. Stones and driftwood suggested alignments. Beneath each, letters, carvings, small objects, deliberately placed, whispering decades of observation, patient, unhurried, infinite in quiet rhythm. At the edge of a narrow forest path, an old stone marker leaned slightly. Beneath it, Lyle uncovered a bundle of papers, documenting subtle shifts in light, water, wind, wildlife, and human presence. The handwriting was calm, deliberate, patient. Patterns connected creek, lake, forest, ridge, dock, cabins, and abandoned structures across Hollow Creek. A hidden trail led to a small clearing. In its center, a circle of stones arranged deliberately. Grace traced edges carefully, noting alignment with dock, creek, ridge, and lake patterns. Each placement deliberate, patient, quiet, echoing decades of observation and careful attention. The path continued toward a shuttered cabin, moonlight spilling across tall grasses. Inside, journals recorded life in Hollow Creek. Creek, lake, forest, roads, abandoned structures. Entries meticulous, noting subtle changes, weather, wildlife, human presence. Patterns across journals mirrored arrangements of stones, driftwood, carved figures, letters across multiple locations. The creek murmured low, mist thick around banks, softening driftwood and stones into gentle shapes. Lyle and Grace moved slowly, observing, lifting stones, reading notes, tracing alignments. Night embraced them, each discovery connected to the next, forming patient, intricate, unending map of observation spanning Hollow Creek, forest, lake, roads, and abandoned structures. The trail wound deeper into dense woods, subtle markers guiding their steps. Beneath one stone, Grace uncovered sketches of tree branches, creek bends, stone alignments, echoing previous arrangements. Each sketch deliberate, calm, patient, linking discoveries across forest and town. At the far edge of the woods, a forgotten dock rested in still water. Driftwood and stones formed subtle arcs along shoreline. Beneath one stone, envelope contained faint notes chronicling tides, wind, birds, clouds. Observations deliberate, patient, continuous, reflecting decades of attentive presence. The soft murmur of the creek, the gentle sway of trees, and the careful placement of objects stretched across Hollow Creek, forming a quiet, deliberate narrative, patient, unhurried, and infinite. As the night deepened, Lyle and Grace sat quietly on the edge of the dock, letting the water murmur beneath them. Mist rolled gently across the surface, softening the outlines of stones and driftwood. The observations, once scattered and seemingly isolated, began to form a subtle pattern, a patient, deliberate attention paid to the rhythms of Hollow Creek over decades. Grace reached into her satchel and spread the sketches, notes, and photographs they had collected across the wooden planks. She traced lines from one location to another, the cairns on the ridge, the stones along the creek, the arrangements in the meadow, the carved figures tucked beneath logs. Slowly, a map emerged, not of streets or addresses, but of observation itself, a quiet chronicle of someone who had watched, recorded, and connected the town, the forest, and the water over years. "Do you see it?" Grace said softly, pointing to the alignment of stones along the creek and the arcs at the dock. "They're not random. They're markers, guiding someone's attention, maybe even guiding themselves." Lyle nodded, leaning back to look along the bank. "It's like they were tracing life," he said quietly. "Not marking events, exactly, but noticing them. Every ripple, every shadow, every change in light." They rose slowly and followed the creek upstream, retracing paths they had explored over the past days. At each marker, stone, driftwood, carved figure, they paused to connect it to the notes or sketches they had found. The process was methodical, reflective. Lyle noticed that some symbols and carvings repeated in multiple locations, subtle echoes that connected places far apart. At the pond, they sat on the grass and spread out the letters they had found beneath the dock and in the cabins. The handwriting varied slightly, as though it belonged to more than one person, but the style was consistent, patient, careful, quiet. The letters spoke of waiting, observing, and recording the smallest shifts in nature and human life. They were meditative, almost contemplative, as if the writer had been more interested in witnessing than in acting. "The person who did this," Grace murmured, "they weren't leaving messages for someone else. They were leaving a record, a way to see time passing." Lyle picked up a carved figure, running his fingers along the smooth edges. Each one felt deliberate, chosen for its shape and placement. "It's a life built quietly," he said, "observing, noticing, arranging, not hiding anything, just chronicling it in a way that no one else would see all at once." They walked slowly back toward the forest ridge, stopping at the cairns. Lyle stacked a few smaller stones atop the tallest cairn, testing the balance. "Every place we found, the dock, the cabin, the schoolhouse, the orchard, they're like nodes," he said. "The letters, the carvings, the sketches, they link the nodes. It's a network of attention." Grace leaned against a tree, scanning the misted valley below. "And it all started with that first note. Look beneath stones." It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation to notice, to pay attention, to slow down. They moved on to the abandoned ranger station. Inside, Grace spread the maps on the dusty desk. Lines drawn between distant clearings and paths matched the alignments they had found in the field. Each map connected multiple locations into a deliberate, coherent pattern. The forest, The creek, the ridges, the meadow, the docks, all were carefully observed, and every mark traced a conscious mindfulness of time and place. The writer lived here, Lal said, pointing to notes chronicling daily observations of weather and water levels. And maybe they walked every path we've been following, keeping track of the smallest changes, day by day, year by year. It's peaceful, in a way, intentional, steady. They continued along the path to the orchard, where the skeletal trees cast long shadows in the fading light. Beneath a gnarled apple tree, Grace unearthed another journal, worn but intact. Inside, entries described the creek's changing current, the flight of birds, the positions of clouds. And gradually, a personal thread appeared, a solitary presence, someone who had spent decades observing Hollow Creek not to intervene, but simply to witness. Sitting on a fallen log, Lau realized that each carved figure, each stone, each note had been part of a quiet meditation on life's rhythm. The town, the water, the forest, they were all part of a continuum, observed and recorded with care. The scattered objects were not clues in the usual sense. They were fragments of attention, of someone living fully in observation, leaving behind a reflection of time itself. As the stars began to glimmer through the thinning mist, Grace folded the sketches and notes carefully. "It's like they built a map of awareness," she said softly. "Not for anyone to follow, just a record of presence, of noticing. And now we're part of it, just by seeing it." Lal smiled quietly, watching the gentle ripple of the creek. "Everything connects," he said. "The creek, the dock, the cabins, the stones, the carvings. All of it, one long, patient observation of life passing. And it's still here, waiting for someone to see it." They lingered at the creek's edge, feeling the calm of the forest, the soft rhythm of water and wind. Slowly, the scattered pieces of letters, carvings, stones, and sketches settled into a coherent whole. Not a dramatic revelation, not a sudden answer, but a quiet understanding of a life spent observing, recording, and honoring the subtle, slow flow of the world around them. Walking back toward the ridge, the patterns they had traced in their minds seemed to pulse gently in the night air. Each step felt reflective, measured. The town, the creek, the forest, the docks, the cabins, all were quiet witnesses to decades of patient attention, and now, Lyle and Grace understood the story being told, not of events, but of mindfulness, care, and the gentle, unhurried passage of life itself. By the meadow, under a sky softened with mist and twilight, they paused one last time. Stones and driftwood, letters and carvings, journals and sketches, they were all threads of the same quiet narrative. The mystery, once fragmented and distant, now revealed itself not in action or violence, but in observation, patience, and reflection. And in the calm, reflective stillness of Hollow Creek, the investigators finally felt the story unfold around them, a slow, deliberate testament to someone who had spent a lifetime noticing, arranging, and quietly bearing witness. Case 3. The fog had settled thick over the edge of the marsh that morning, curling between the reeds like soft, slow-moving smoke. The air was heavy with a quiet dampness, and the first hint of the sun barely penetrated the pale gray sky. When the local mail carrier noticed a rowboat tethered to a crooked post in the shallow water, swaying gently though the lake had been empty just yesterday, it struck him as odd, but nothing else seemed amiss at first. The boat had no name, no markings, and its oars rested neatly inside, as if someone had intended to return. Only a single leather satchel sat in the center, its clasp slightly ajar. The marsh stretched around it in muted tones, grays, soft greens, and the reflective silver of still water. A heron lifted lazily from a distant bank, its wings brushing silently through the fog. Detective Marlowe arrived later that afternoon, the gravel crunching softly under his boots as he walked the narrow trail from the main road. The town beyond the marsh was small and quiet, bordered by rolling hills and thick clusters of pine. He paused at the water's edge, noting the way the fog muffled sound, how even the occasional calls of birds seemed softened, almost reverent. The satchel contained nothing immediately revealing, only a folded map of the surrounding county and a small notebook with entries written in a meticulous, looping hand. The notebook mentioned towns that Marlowe had never visited, farms tucked between hills, and paths along streams that wound past old stone foundations, places where few still lived. Each line felt measured, quiet, deliberate, and just slightly out of place among the otherwise ordinary landscape. Marlowe spent hours tracing the lines on the map, the paper damp against his fingers, the marsh still and unyielding. The boat had been found near a bend where reeds grew tall, almost concealing the water. He imagined the path it might have taken across the lake, imagining someone gliding silently through the fog, unseen. The light dimmed, the marsh taking on a muted lavender glow as dusk approached. At the small inn in the town, Marlowe spoke to the innkeeper, an older woman with hands softened by decades of dishwashing and woodwork. She remembered seeing a stranger walking along the path by the creek a few nights ago, a solitary figure with a hood pulled low. She said nothing seemed unusual at the time, but something in her tone suggested she had remembered it later, as one recalls a small, strange detail that refuses to leave the mind. The next morning, the road leading from the inn wound through mist-shrouded fields and low stone walls. Marlowe stopped at a small barn, its paint faded to a gentle gray, and noticed footprints in the soft earth, too small to be a man's, too light to belong to the horses that grazed lazily nearby. They led to a wooden door at the rear of the barn, where a faint scratching sound seemed to emanate from inside. Marlowe waited, listening, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. He returned to the marsh that evening, the sky brushed with pale oranges and muted blues. The boat had drifted slightly, now leaning toward the reeds. In the distance, a lone figure walked along the far bank, pausing now and then to peer into the water. Marlowe could not tell if it was someone observing the boat, or if the boat itself had been left for observation. He remained on the path, quiet, allowing the mist to swallow both him and the distant figure, as though the marsh were inviting him into its stillness. Over the next several days, Marlowe visited nearby cabins and farmhouses, each surrounded by whispering pines and quiet fields. The townspeople were polite but reserved, offering little information beyond routine observations. A gate left open, a light that flickered in the distance at night, the faint smell of smoke from a chimney that no longer had a hearth. Each detail was small, barely noticeable, but together they began to form a subtle pattern, a rhythm of presence and absence, of things appearing just long enough to be seen and then quietly disappearing again. At the edge of a wooded hill, Marlowe found a clearing with stones arranged in a rough circle, worn by years of rain and frost. Among them lay small fragments of porcelain, delicate and pale, like forgotten teacups broken long ago. The clearing felt suspended in time, untouched by the casual passing of people or weather. A breeze stirred the leaves, soft and almost musical, and he realized that no footprints led to or from the circle, except faint depressions where the earth had been pressed down by something heavier. In the following days, he explored paths that followed the streams indicated in the notebook. The water was slow and deep in places, reflecting the sky in muted silver tones, while moss clung to stones and roots dipped gently into the current. A cabin on the far side of one stream had windows dark and shuttered, but smoke curled softly from a chimney. Marlowe knocked, and the door opened to reveal a room untouched by time. Shelves lined with notebooks, maps, and small trinkets, each labeled in the same looping handwriting he had found in the satchel. The air in the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and dried herbs. A rocking chair moved slightly, as if nudged by the quiet draft from the open window. Marlowe ran his fingers over the notebooks, noticing careful sketches of the marsh, of the lake, of the boats and birds. Each drawing seemed peaceful, serene, yet subtly disquieting, like observing someone's private ritual without their knowing. Further along a dirt road that wound between soft hills and fields of late-blooming flowers, Marlowe discovered a small shop that sold candles, hand-carved wooden toys, and jars of honey. The shopkeeper, a young man with gentle eyes, mentioned seeing someone who matched the description from the inn, moving quietly at twilight along the edge of the woods. He remembered a faint whistle, almost melodic, that lingered in the air and then faded. Marlowe listened, picturing the sound echoing through the trees, a quiet signal in the hush of the evening. The marsh itself continued to offer small, subtle observations. A piece of driftwood positioned upright in shallow water. A cluster of reeds broken in a pattern that seemed deliberate. A fox watching from a hilltop, motionless, before slipping silently into the underbrush. Each element spoke in whispers rather than shouts, revealing a narrative that required patient attention. Marlowe returned off into the circle of stones, noting slight changes over time. The arrangement of the porcelain fragments shifted, a small feather appeared where none had been before, dew forming in patterns along the grass. The marsh and its surrounding hills seemed to breathe along with him, the quiet wind carrying both clarity and uncertainty. A handwritten note eventually surfaced in the notebook, tucked between sketches of the lake and marsh. It read simply, in careful cursive, that the author preferred to observe rather than be observed, and that the patterns of life were sometimes more telling than the events themselves. Marlowe folded the note and held it against his chest, aware that understanding required patience, and that some truths revealed themselves only to those willing to sit quietly, listen, and watch. The days grew longer, the light softer, and the fog returned intermittently, curling over water and fields, smoothing the edges of the world. Each morning Marlowe walked along the marsh, noting the subtle changes, the way a heron lingered longer on one bank, how the mist clung differently to the reeds, the faint, distant hum of water over rocks. Each observation added depth to the quiet narrative he was slowly piecing together. Along the ridge overlooking the lake, Marlowe discovered an old, abandoned boathouse. Its paint flaked in gentle layers, the wood groaning softly in the wind. Inside, he found remnants of canvas sails, rope coils, and a single lantern with a wick long since dried. The scent of aged wood and river water hung in the air, settling like a soft, tangible memory. The town itself seemed to watch quietly as the investigation unfolded. Windows reflected soft gold light at dusk, and doors remained closed, as if waiting. Streets were lined with trees that whispered in the breeze, their leaves creating muted patterns on the pavement. Conversations were hushed, stories shared in careful tones over coffee in the mornings, with laughter and observation mingling softly. Along a narrow, overgrown trail behind one of the farmlands, Marlowe found scattered shells, smooth and pale, remnants of something once carried from distant waters. They were out of place in the forested hills, yet they fit into the quiet pattern he had begun to notice. The presence of the past, hints of movement, careful placement, and subtle messages left in plain sight. Each evening, as the light faded and the mist settled once more over the marsh and hills, Marlowe returned to the water's edge, observing the rowboat that had started it all. The satchel remained where it had been placed, now accompanied by small, new tokens: a feather, a folded leaf, a pebble with a natural groove. The marsh breathed around them, and the world seemed to quiet in recognition of his patience. From the edge of the town, a narrow dirt road led toward the distant mountains. Marlowe followed it slowly, passing abandoned cottages, creaking fences, and wildflowers brushing against the tires of his car. Along the way, he noticed faint markings etched into stone, patterns that echoed those he had seen in the notebooks and sketches. The signs were small, almost imperceptible, yet they carried a sense of intention, a whisper of presence. At the peak of one gentle hill, the view opened to a wide valley, the lake below glinting softly under the pale sunlight. Marlowe stood for a long time, listening to the distant lapping of water, the occasional bird call, the subtle wind threading through grass and reeds. Each sound seemed a piece of the larger rhythm, a quiet harmony that told of patterns, presence, and absence. He returned slowly, the soft earth underfoot, the horizon fading to muted shades of gray and lavender as evening approached. Every visit to the marsh, to the woods, to the abandoned cabins, revealed small additions: the gentle drift of reeds, footprints barely there, a lantern left in a careful place. Marlowe realized that the investigation itself had become a quiet observation of life, a slow unfolding of events that could only be understood by patient, gentle attention. Alongside the marsh, in the fading light, he noticed a small wooden dock, its planks worn but sturdy. A single rowboat, separate from the first, rested gently against it, containing only a notebook left open to a blank page. Marlowe knelt to examine it, feeling the cool, damp air settle around him, and for a moment, he simply listened, the world quiet, the water soft, the reeds whispering their slow, patient story. He moved through the hills and valleys, following faint paths, abandoned tracks, and streams that wound between moss-covered rocks. Every place he visited seemed to hold a memory, subtle and waiting. A lantern swinging gently from a tree branch, a carved stone half hidden by grass, a feather tucked beneath a rock. The patterns were never abrupt, never loud, but persistent, each a quiet invitation to notice. And in the quiet of the marsh, with fog curling along the water and the soft hum of distant insects, Marlowe continued to observe, record, and understand. Each detail was small, measured, and deliberate, forming a slow, gentle narrative that required patience and presence. The story unfolded quietly, like water tracing the contours of the land, and the world held its breath as he followed its subtle, persistent rhythm. The trail of the unknown led him next to a narrow creek that wound past the remains of an old mill. The structure was abandoned, its wheel resting in still water, moss growing along the edges where the wooden slats had begun to soften. Marlowe walked along the creek, noticing how the water's reflection captured the pale sky above, and how tiny ripples shifted slowly, deliberately, as though marking a path he could not yet fully see. A small wooden bridge crossed the creek, planks uneven and creaking softly underfoot. Beneath it, the water had gathered a thin layer of silt, forming delicate patterns that hinted at the movement of small creatures. Marlowe knelt to observe, tracing the shapes with his finger, and realized that even the smallest details, the flow of water, the placement of stones, the bend of a branch, were part of the quiet story that had begun at the edge of the marsh. As twilight settled, the first stars appeared faintly above the hills. The marsh exhaled, mist drifting along the water, blending sky and earth in a soft haze. Marlowe stood still, listening to the subtle movements, the faint rustle of reeds, the whisper of wind through trees, the distant, almost imperceptible sound of water moving over stones. And in that stillness, he felt the story of the marsh, the lake, and the notebooks, revealing itself slowly, patiently, without urgency, in a rhythm meant to be noticed only by those willing to wait. He returned again to the first rowboat, the leather satchel unchanged except for a single small stone resting on top. Its surface was smooth, rounded, cool under his fingers. He knelt, touched it lightly, and listened. The marsh remained quiet, the water still, and the fog curling softly around him. Every sound, every movement, every subtle detail whispered the continuing story, patient and gentle, waiting to be traced, observed, and understood. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Marlowe followed the edge of the lake to a series of low, rolling hills, where wildflowers had begun to bloom in muted pastels. Each step was deliberate, slow, measured, and he noticed the way the sunlight touched the tips of grass, how shadows stretched and softened in the haze of evening. Small disturbances in the earth, a footprint here, a rock slightly moved there, suggested a presence, careful and quiet, leaving traces for attentive eyes. By a cluster of abandoned cabins at the far end of the lake, Marlowe discovered a series of faint paths winding into the woods, each overgrown but still discernible. Alongside them, small piles of twigs and stones had been arranged in deliberate shapes, like markers or messages. He paused, studying the arrangement, noting the precision in the placement, and realized that each small sign, each quiet trace, was part of a story unfolding slowly in the edges of the world, waiting for those willing to notice. The sun dipped lower, brushing the horizon in soft apricot and lavender, and the marsh seemed to glow faintly in the fading light. Marlowe stayed near the water, watching the gentle ripple of currents, the subtle shifts of reeds, the distant flight of a lone bird across the sky. Each element spoke in whispers, each subtle detail weaving into a calm, persistent rhythm that demanded patience, presence, and quiet observation. From a small dock near the far bank, a single lantern had been left, its glass clear, the wick unlit. He picked it up, noting the careful placement, feeling the cool metal in his hands. The marsh exhaled around him, the fog curling softly, and he realized that the quiet story continued, patient and deliberate, revealing itself slowly through careful observation and gentle attention. A faint trail led from the dock into a grove of trees, trunks pale in the soft light, moss clinging in muted patches along their bases. Marlowe followed it slowly, each footstep quiet, blending with the natural rhythm of the place. Small signs continued to appear, feathers tucked beneath stones, a leaf placed atop a root, a single pine cone balanced carefully. Each addition whispered of intention, of presence, of a story unfolding without haste. The brook at the edge of the grove murmured softly, its gentle current winding between mossy stones. He knelt, tracing the water's path with his fingers, noting how it shaped the land, creating pockets of quiet and reflection. Small fish darted just beneath the surface, leaving ripples that spread outward in delicate, fading circles. The rhythm of water, earth, and wind seemed to echo the same slow, persistent pace of the mystery itself. Along the ridge above the brook, he discovered the remains of an old stone wall, worn and moss-covered, suggesting boundaries from another time. In its cracks, tiny wildflowers had taken root, delicate and resilient. Marlowe paused, noting the interplay of decay and life, of presence and absence, the quiet persistence of subtle patterns across the landscape. Near the edge of the ridge, an old wooden bench rested, facing the distant marsh and lake. Its surface was smooth from years of use, the wood faded to soft gray. He sat there for a long time, observing the light shifting over the water, the gentle movement of reeds, the quiet flight of birds returning to hidden nests. The world was slow and deliberate, and so too was the unfolding story. A small, narrow path wound from the bench down toward a cluster of reeds. Marlowe followed it carefully, noticing a faint, almost imperceptible groove in the soil that suggested repeated passage. Alongside it, a single feather had been placed delicately atop a stone, pale against the dark earth. Each subtle sign, each quiet trace, contributed to the patient rhythm of observation, requiring no hurry, no dramatic conclusion, only attentive presence. At the water's edge, the rowboat remained. The satchel sat undisturbed, a small token of the beginning of this slow, unfolding story. The marsh exhaled, fog curling softly, and Marlowe allowed himself to simply observe the gentle ripple of the water, the subtle swaying of reeds, the distant call of a heron. The world held its breath, patient and quiet, and the mystery continued, measured in whispers, patterns, and delicate traces that revealed themselves only to careful, gentle attention. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth, brushing against the hills and the marsh. Marlowe walked slowly along a narrow trail, noting small stones arranged in patterns, the gentle arch of branches over the path, the soft light filtering through leaves. Every detail was deliberate, every movement quiet, contributing to the unfolding narrative, patient and calm, inviting observation without urgency. Near a bend in the stream that fed the lake, he discovered a series of small wooden stakes, each carved with faint symbols. Moss had begun to creep along their edges, softening the lines, and yet the intention behind their placement remained clear. He traced them with his fingers, noting the subtle variations, the careful positioning, the quiet care in each mark. A solitary owl observed from a high branch, its wings folded, eyes reflecting the fading light. Its presence was calm, patient, and unhurried, echoing the tone of the world around Marlowe. He continued along the stream, noting the way the water shifted over stones, the muted colors of fallen leaves, the gentle sway of reeds along the bank. Each element contributed to the slow, measured rhythm of the landscape, part of the quiet story waiting to be observed. Near a hollowed tree at the edge of the woods, he found a small box, weathered and gray, partially concealed beneath moss. Inside were folded papers, sketches of the lake, marsh, and surrounding hills, all drawn with meticulous care. Each line was deliberate, each observation quiet, forming a subtle, patient narrative that unfolded slowly, without urgency, in the rhythm of the land itself. The marsh reflected the last light of day, soft purples and muted golds blending across the water. Marlowe walked slowly back to the dock, each footstep absorbed by the damp earth, the soft hum of insects rising as twilight deepened. The rowboat and satchel waited, quiet and undisturbed. The world seemed to hold its breath, the story unfolding gently, measured in patterns, presence, and subtle, deliberate traces. The narrow road leading from the marsh to the hills beyond was lined with trees, their branches whispering softly in the evening breeze. He followed it, observing small signs along the way. A stone laid atop another, a single feather tucked beneath a root, the subtle shift of earth where something or someone had passed. Each detail contributed to the slow, gentle rhythm of the mystery, forming a narrative that required patience, observation, and quiet attention. From the edge of a low cliff overlooking the lake, the world stretched in soft, muted tones. Marlowe stood and listened, water lapping against reeds, wind stirring the pines, distant bird calls fading into the evening. Each element was deliberate, quiet, patient, as if the landscape itself were narrating a story in whispers. The marsh, the lake, the notebooks, the traces left along the trails, all formed a slow, persistent rhythm, waiting to be understood by those willing to move with its quiet pace. The small cabin at the far edge of the marsh remained still, smoke curling gently from its chimney. Marlowe approached, noticing small tokens outside, a pebble, a leaf, a feather, arranged in delicate patterns. He knelt to observe, feeling the rhythm of presence in the careful placement, sensing the gentle unfolding of the story across the marsh, the hills, and the quiet spaces between. A faint path led from the cabin toward the distant woods, winding between trees and over gentle rises. Along it, he noted small arrangements of stones, each one subtle, almost imperceptible, yet deliberate. The trail continued patiently, guiding him through the quiet rhythm of observation, pattern, and presence, revealing a narrative that unfolded slowly, deliberately, in harmony with the calm, gentle world around him. The fog began to return, curling softly across the marsh and hills. Marlowe walked slowly, noticing the way light diffused through it, softening shapes and edges, creating a calm, muted world. Every ripple in the water, every sway of the reeds, every faint footprint became part of the quiet story, each element contributing to the slow, deliberate rhythm that guided his observation. He paused by the edge of a small pond, the surface smooth, reflecting the gray sky above. A single lantern rested on the shore, unlit, its glass clear. He knelt, touching it lightly, feeling the cool metal, and listened to the marsh exhaling softly, carrying with it the gentle, patient narrative that had begun at the first rowboat and continued quietly, deliberately, in the subtle, measured world around him. The path along the hills led to a clearing where sunlight filtered through the trees in muted beams. Small patterns of stones and twigs marked the area, delicate and intentional. Marlowe observed each one, tracing the subtle rhythms and presence within them, noting how the quiet, patient world around him continued to unfold a story in whispers, in patterns, and in gentle, deliberate traces across the marsh, the lake, and the surrounding hills. He walked slowly back to the dock, the marsh soft and quiet under the evening sky. The rowboat and satchel waited, calm and undisturbed. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth, The water rippled gently against the reeds, and the world held its breath, patient and deliberate, revealing its slow, subtle narrative only to those willing to move with its quiet, persistent rhythm. Along the trail leading from the dock toward the distant hills, small signs continued to appear. Feathers, stones, subtle shifts in earth and moss. Marlowe followed each one carefully, noting their deliberate placement, observing the calm, patient rhythm that unfolded with every step. The marsh, the woods, the cabins, the lake, and the hills formed a quiet, immersive world, each element contributing to a story that moved with soft, measured persistence, inviting patient attention and gentle observation. The twilight deepened, the marsh reflecting the last hues of soft purple and muted gold. Marlowe walked slowly along the edge of the water, noting the gentle ripple, the swaying reeds, the distant flight of birds returning to their nests. Each movement, each subtle detail, formed part of the quiet rhythm of the unfolding mystery, patient and deliberate, revealing itself only to those willing to sit quietly, observe, and follow its soft, persistent pace. A small rowboat drifted gently, tied loosely to the dock, its oars resting neatly inside. The leather satchel remained atop the center bench, quiet and undisturbed. Marlowe knelt, feeling the cool wood beneath his hands, listening to the marsh exhaling softly around him. Every detail, every ripple, every feather, stone, and trace contributed to the slow, gentle narrative that continued to unfold patiently across the marsh, the lake, and the surrounding hills, waiting for careful, attentive observation. The narrow trail wound past reeds and low hills, soft earth underfoot, trees whispering gently in the evening breeze. Small patterns continued to mark the path, stones balanced delicately, feathers placed with care, faint depressions in the soil suggesting deliberate movement. Marlowe followed slowly, observing each detail, feeling the rhythm of quiet presence that threaded through the landscape, guiding him through the gentle, deliberate unfolding of the story across marsh, lake, and hill. The world was muted, soft, patient. The fog drifted over water and reeds. Light faded into muted grays and gentle lavender. The marsh exhaled slowly. Each small sign, each careful placement, each subtle trace contributed to the calm, persistent rhythm of the mystery. Marlowe observed, followed, and listened, moving gently with the landscape as the quiet narrative unfolded in whispers, patterns, and deliberate, patient presence. The hills beyond the marsh were quiet, the trees standing still in the fading light. Along narrow paths, small arrangements of stones and twigs marked spaces, almost imperceptible, yet deliberate. Marlowe walked slowly, each step careful, absorbing the rhythm of the landscape, noticing the subtle shifts in earth and foliage, the soft ripple of distant water, the gentle sway of reeds in the evening breeze. At the edge of the marsh, a final token rested, a small, smooth stone atop the satchel, now accompanied by a delicate feather. Marlowe knelt, touching the objects lightly, listening to the quiet exhale of the world around him. Every sound, every movement, every subtle detail contributed to the calm, persistent narrative that continued to unfold, patient and deliberate, in the marsh, the lake, and the hills, waiting for those willing to observe with gentle, quiet attention. The evening deepened, the fog curling softly across water and reeds, light fading into muted shades of gray and lavender. Marlowe stood by the rowboat, observing the gentle ripple of the lake, the soft sway of the marsh grasses, the faint, deliberate traces left along the trails. The world moved in a slow, quiet rhythm, revealing a story that unfolded patiently, deliberately, and without urgency, waiting to be discovered in the subtle, gentle patterns of the landscape itself. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine, damp earth, and distant wildflowers. He walked slowly along a narrow trail toward the hills, observing small signs of careful placement: stones, feathers, leaves arranged with subtle intention. Each observation contributed to the gentle, persistent rhythm of the narrative, forming a quiet, immersive story that moved patiently through the marsh, the lake, and the hills, revealing itself only to those willing to follow its slow, deliberate pace. The sun dipped further, leaving soft pastel hues across the sky. Marsh and hills exhaled, the water reflecting the fading light. Marlowe paused along the path, observing the gentle sway of reeds, the distant flight of a heron, the subtle disturbances of soil and moss that hinted at deliberate presence. Each detail became a quiet note in the slow, immersive narrative that continued to unfold, patient and gentle, across the landscape. The rowboat rocked softly in the water, the satchel resting atop its bench. Fog drifted over the marsh, curling and fading with the soft breeze. Marlowe knelt, listening to the subtle rhythm of the marsh, the gentle ripple of water, the quiet movement of reeds and wildlife. Every element, the stones, the feathers, the traces along the paths, formed a calm, deliberate narrative that unfolded slowly, inviting patient observation and gentle attention, continuing quietly into the evening. The hills and marsh exhaled in muted tones, the sky fading to soft lavender and gray. Along the narrow trails, each subtle mark and arrangement contributed to the gentle rhythm of presence and pattern. Marlowe moved slowly, observing, listening, tracing the quiet narrative woven through marsh, lake, and hills, patient and deliberate, revealing a story in soft, persistent whispers, in deliberate traces, and in the calm, immersive flow of the landscape itself. The air grew cooler, the fog settling softly over water and reeds. The rowboat remained, tied gently to the dock, the satchel atop its bench, small stones and feathers resting upon it. Marlowe observed quietly, noting the soft exhale of the marsh, the gentle rhythm of water and wind, and the subtle, deliberate traces that continued to form a patient, immersive story in the quiet landscape. Along the trails leading into the hills, faint signs persisted, stones balanced carefully, leaves placed with care, subtle depressions in the soft earth. Marlowe followed each one slowly, observing the quiet rhythm and deliberate presence embedded in the landscape. The marsh, the lake, the hills, and the narrow paths all contributed to the immersive, calm narrative that unfolded gradually, patiently, in whispers and delicate traces across the environment. The sun had fully set, leaving the world in muted twilight. The marsh exhaled softly, the reeds swaying gently, the water reflecting the fading light. Marlowe stood near the rowboat, listening to the calm rhythm of the landscape, observing the subtle signs, the careful placements, and the quiet narrative that continued to unfold patiently, deliberately, in the marsh, the lake, and the surrounding hills. The soft breeze carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Trails wound gently through the hills, subtle signs appearing along the way. Stones, feathers, leaves arranged with care. Marlowe walked slowly, absorbing the patient, immersive rhythm of the narrative, noting the deliberate, quiet presence embedded in the landscape, and the gentle, persistent unfolding of the story in whispers, patterns, and careful observation. The night deepened, the fog curling over the marsh, the water reflecting the soft light of a pale moon. The rowboat remained tied to the dock, the satchel resting atop its bench, small tokens carefully placed upon it. Marlowe knelt, observing the calm rhythm of the marsh, the deliberate traces along trails and hills, and the patient, immersive story that continued to unfold quietly, slowly, and deliberately across the landscape. The distant hills faded into muted gray, the marsh exhaled softly, and the narrow trails continued to wind through trees and fields. Small arrangements of stones, feathers, and leaves marked the path, subtle and deliberate. Marlowe moved slowly, absorbing each element, listening to the gentle rhythm of presence and pattern, and following the calm, immersive narrative that unfolded patiently, quietly, and deliberately across marsh, lake, and hills. The water rippled gently, the reeds swayed softly, and the wind carried faint whispers through the trees. Marlowe stood by the rowboat, the satchel atop its bench, observing the subtle details, the stones, feathers, and small tokens placed with care. The marsh, lake, and hills continued to exhale in muted rhythm, revealing a slow, patient story in whispers, deliberate traces, and calm, immersive observation, inviting attention without urgency. The night deepened further, the fog curling gently over water and hills, soft and deliberate. The trails winding through the marsh and woods revealed subtle patterns, stones balanced, leaves placed, earth shifted with care. Marlowe followed slowly, observing the quiet rhythm, the deliberate presence in each trace, and the patient, immersive narrative that unfolded gently across the landscape, calm and persistent in its whispering, deliberate pace. The rowboat remained, tied to the dock, the satchel atop its bench, small stones and feathers resting upon it. Marlowe knelt, feeling the cool wood, listening to the soft exhale of the marsh, the gentle ripple of water, the faint movements of reeds and wildlife. Every detail contributed to the calm, deliberate story that continued to unfold patiently, slowly, and quietly across marsh, lake, and hills, revealing its subtle narrative only to those willing to move with its gentle, persistent rhythm. The path into the hills remained quiet, small arrangements of stones and twigs marking subtle patterns along the way. Marlowe walked slowly, observing the deliberate, patient rhythm, the quiet presence in each trace. The marsh, lake, hills, and trails formed an immersive, calm narrative that unfolded gradually, patiently, in whispers, patterns, and delicate traces, revealing its story only to attentive, gentle observation. The fog settled thickly over marsh and hills, curling softly around reeds and water. The rowboat and satchel remained undisturbed, small tokens carefully arranged upon the bench. Marlowe observed, listening to the gentle rhythm of water, wind, and reeds, tracing the deliberate, patient narrative that continued to unfold slowly and quietly across the marsh, lake, and hills, inviting calm, immersive observation in its subtle, persistent flow. The night deepened, stars faintly visible above the hills. Trails winding through marsh and woods revealed subtle, deliberate patterns, stones, feathers, leaves carefully placed, traces in soft earth. Marlowe moved slowly, observing the quiet rhythm and patient presence in each detail, following the calm, immersive narrative that unfolded gently, persistently, and deliberately across the landscape, revealing its story only to those who followed its gentle, deliberate pace. The marsh exhaled softly, water rippling gently, reeds swaying in the quiet night breeze. Marlowe knelt by the rowboat, the satchel atop its bench, small stones and feathers resting upon it. He observed, listened, and moved slowly through the landscape, tracing the patient, immersive rhythm of the narrative that continued to unfold in whispers, patterns, and deliberate, gentle presence across marsh, lake, and hills, patient and calm in its quiet, persistent story. The fog wrapped the landscape in muted gray and lavender tones, soft and deliberate. Trails through the marsh and hills revealed subtle signs, stones, feathers, leaves arranged with care. Marlowe followed slowly, observing the quiet rhythm of the world, the deliberate presence in each trace, and the patient, immersive narrative unfolding across the landscape, gentle, calm, and persistent in its quiet, deliberate pace. The rowboat swayed softly in the water, tied to the dock, the satchel resting atop its bench. The marsh exhaled, wind stirring reeds gently, water rippling in muted tones. Marlowe observed quietly, noting each deliberate trace, the stones, feathers, and subtle signs along trails and hills, and followed the calm, immersive story that unfolded patiently, slowly, and quietly across marsh, lake, and surrounding landscape, inviting gentle attention and presence. The night continued, fog curling over water and hills, soft and patient. Small arrangements of stones and twigs marked trails subtly, deliberate in their quiet placement. Marlowe walked slowly, absorbing each detail, observing the calm rhythm of presence, and following the gentle, persistent narrative that unfolded quietly, immersively, and deliberately across marsh, lake, and hills, patient and deliberate in its soft, persistent story. The rowboat remained, the satchel atop its bench, small tokens carefully placed. Marsh, water, and hills exhaled softly, wind carrying muted whispers through reeds and trees. Marlowe knelt, listening, observing, and moving slowly through the landscape, tracing the gentle, patient rhythm of the narrative unfolding quietly, deliberately, and calmly across marsh, lake, and hills, inviting attentive, immersive observation without urgency. The fog settled, night deepened, trails winding through marsh and hills revealed subtle, deliberate patterns. Stones, feathers, leaves marked the paths, soft earth showing faint depressions of careful movement. Marlowe followed slowly, noting the quiet rhythm of presence, the patient, immersive story unfolding gently across the landscape, calm, deliberate, and persistent, revealing itself in soft, deliberate whispers, patterns, and traces. The rowboat swayed in gentle water, satchel atop its bench, small stones and feathers resting quietly. Marsh, lake, and hills exhaled, soft wind moving through reeds, water rippling gently. Marlowe observed, knelt, and listened, tracing each subtle, deliberate detail, following the calm, immersive narrative that continued to unfold patiently, quietly, and gently across the landscape, revealing its story only to careful, attentive presence. The fog curled softly over marsh and hills, muted gray and lavender tones blending into night. Trails marked with subtle signs, stones, feathers, leaves arranged deliberately, continued to guide his slow, careful observation. Marlowe moved quietly, absorbing the rhythm of the world, the deliberate presence in each trace, following the patient, immersive narrative unfolding gently across marsh, lake, and hills, soft and persistent in its quiet story. The rowboat and satchel remained, gentle ripples across the water, soft wind through reeds. Marlowe knelt, feeling the cool wood, observing subtle tokens, and listening to the calm rhythm of the marsh, the deliberate traces across trails and hills. The narrative unfolded slowly, gently, and patiently, immersed in whispers, patterns, and presence, moving quietly across marsh, lake, and surrounding landscape. The night was deep, fog curling softly, trails winding subtly through marsh and hills. Stones, feathers, leaves placed deliberately marked the path, traces of quiet presence. Marlowe followed, moving slowly, observing each detail, listening to the calm, patient rhythm, tracing the gentle, immersive story that unfolded quietly, deliberately, and persistently across marsh, lake, and hills, inviting attentive observation. The marsh exhaled softly, water rippling gently, reeds swaying with the wind. The rowboat and satchel rested quietly, small tokens placed carefully atop the bench. Marlowe observed, moved slowly through the landscape, tracing the deliberate, gentle narrative that continued to unfold patiently, quietly, and immersively across marsh, lake, and hills, soft, calm, and persistent in its quiet story. The fog thickened, night deepened, muted tones blending the marsh, lake, and hills into soft grays and lavenders. Trails revealed subtle, deliberate arrangements of stones, feathers, and leaves, faint traces of careful movement. Marlowe moved slowly, observing, listening, and following the patient, immersive narrative that unfolded quietly, deliberately, and gently, forming a calm, persistent story across the landscape. The rowboat swayed gently in the water, the satchel atop its bench, small stones and feathers resting quietly. Marsh, lake, and hills exhaled in soft rhythm, the wind stirring reeds and the faint murmur of distant water carrying across the still night. Marlowe stood on the dock for a long while, listening, before deciding to follow a narrow, overgrown road that led toward the edge of the forest. The gravel crunched softly beneath his boots, each step measured, deliberate, blending into the quiet symphony of rustling leaves and the gentle drip of dew from pine branches. The road widened slightly as he entered the forest, the trees growing taller and closer together, their trunks pale in the moonlight. Fallen needles muffled his footsteps, and the occasional owl called softly, its voice distant yet comforting. Alongside the path, he noticed a faint wooden fence, weathered and leaning, partially hidden beneath moss and tangled vines. Its posts were chipped and uneven, as if the line it marked had been abandoned long ago. Through a break in the trees, he glimpsed a clearing with the remains of a building. Its roof had collapsed in gentle angles, allowing moonlight to spill across the floor. Inside, small fragments of furniture remained, dust settled in muted layers, and a few broken glass panes reflected faint slivers of light. Marlowe moved carefully, observing the subtle arrangements of debris, noticing how some objects had been placed deliberately, books stacked at odd angles, a chair tipped to face the doorway. Outside the building, a narrow creek wound quietly through the underbrush. Its water moved slowly, smooth over stones, carrying reflections of the moon and branches. Marlowe followed it a short distance and discovered a small wooden footbridge, its planks uneven but stable. Beneath it, the water had shaped small pools, and tiny fish darted through, leaving faint ripples. A single feather floated on the surface, catching the moonlight like a pale, deliberate mark. The next morning, he returned to town and spoke to a shopkeeper in a quiet general store. She was arranging jars of preserves on a shelf, her movements slow and deliberate. She mentioned seeing a figure walking along the edge of the forest at first light, carrying a small bundle and moving with careful attention. Nothing seemed alarming at the time, she said, but she remembered the posture, rigid, measured, and the sense that the person was aware of being observed without acknowledging it. Following her directions, Marlowe drove along a winding, narrow road that skirted the edge of the forest and led to a small ranger station. The building was simple, painted pale green, with a single light glowing in the window. He spoke to the ranger, a man with a gentle, calm manner who remembered seeing footprints in the soft earth near the station over several days, small, deliberate, moving from tree to tree, appearing and disappearing without explanation. The ranger suggested the pattern seemed almost ritualistic, though subtle, hidden in plain view. Beyond the station, a gravel path led to a cluster of old cabins. Each was painted in muted earth tones, surrounded by wildflowers and grasses swaying gently in the breeze. Marlowe walked slowly, noting the care with which the cabins had been maintained despite their isolation. On the porch of one, a lantern had been left unlit, and beside it, a small pile of stones arranged in an almost geometric pattern. The air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, the breeze carrying distant whispers from the forest. Near the lake, he discovered a dock that extended into calm water, worn smooth by years of use. A rowboat had been left tied to the side, its oars neatly placed, and a notebook lay inside. The pages were blank, yet the binding felt used, softened by frequent handling. Marlowe traced his fingers along the cover, noting subtle indentations that suggested someone had pressed symbols or letters onto the surface, though none were visible to the eye. A quiet road led him to a small abandoned mill, its wheel long since still. The building smelled of aged timber and damp earth. Inside, beams of moonlight passed through broken windows, illuminating small piles of sawdust and carefully arranged tools. Marlowe noticed marks etched into the wood of the support beams, faint scratches that seemed deliberate, forming patterns that were not immediately readable but suggested a rhythm, a code embedded in the environment itself. In the forest beyond the mill, a narrow trail wound up a gentle hill. Marlowe followed it slowly, noting faint signs of passage, small broken twigs, depressions in moss, a leaf placed atop a stone. At the crest, the trees opened to a clearing where a small wooden structure rested, roof intact, but walls weathered. Inside, he found sketches of the marsh, lake, and hills, but also of places he had not yet visited: a dock by another pond, a cabin deep in the woods, a trail leading into the mountains. Each sketch was meticulous, quiet, and deliberate, drawn in soft pencil strokes that felt almost meditative. Continuing along the hill, he discovered a hidden path leading to a small pond. Water lilies floated across the surface, and reeds bent gently with the breeze. Along the shore, a small wooden platform had been constructed, simple and precise. On it rested a pile of smooth stones, a feather, and a folded piece of paper. The paper contained a single, measured line: "Observe the quiet, and presence will reveal itself." Marlowe folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. Further down the path, a ranger's cabin appeared among tall pines. Smoke rose softly from its chimney, and a small garden bloomed in muted colors. The ranger inside spoke slowly, recalling seeing someone moving quietly through the forest at dawn, carrying bundles of notebooks and occasionally leaving small markers along the trails. The ranger had followed at a distance once, but lost sight, finding only faint traces of careful, deliberate movement. At dusk, Marlowe walked a gravel road that hugged the edge of the hills, the forest thick to one side and open meadows to the other. A single lantern flickered faintly at the side of the road, unlit, and near it lay a small, folded bundle tied with twine. Inside were feathers, smooth stones, and a small journal containing careful sketches of reeds swaying in the marsh, ripples in the lake, and trails through the forest. Each page seemed intended to be seen slowly, with attention, as if the observer were part of the quiet rhythm itself. A dock farther along the lake appeared nearly hidden beneath tall grasses. A canoe rested quietly against the wooden beams, its surface weathered and polished by years of gentle use. Inside, he found a single, small satchel containing a compass, several blank pages, and a tiny brush, worn soft. Marlowe traced his fingers over it, sensing careful preparation for something deliberate and patient, a presence woven into the landscape, gentle and persistent. Beyond the dock, a dirt road wound toward distant hills, passing abandoned cottages with soft, muted colors, chimneys curling faint smoke, and gardens overgrown yet orderly. Along the roadside, small stones had been arranged in quiet patterns, subtle, deliberate, as though marking passage or guiding attention. Marlowe walked slowly, absorbing the soft rhythm of the environment, feeling the deliberate presence embedded in the traces, and noting the patient narrative unfolding in whispers, patterns, and delicate arrangements. At the edge of the forest, he discovered a narrow path leading to a small ranger outpost. It was simple, functional, and quiet. Inside, papers were neatly stacked, maps marked with faint, subtle symbols. The ranger there recalled hearing soft rustling at twilight along the trails, seeing shadows move between trees without source, noticing small, deliberate placements of stones and twigs that had appeared overnight. Each sign suggested presence, intention, a slow, patient story embedded in the landscape. Across a low ridge, a small pond appeared, glassy and still under the soft moonlight. A wooden platform extended slightly into the water, and atop it rested a collection of small stones arranged in gentle arcs, a single feather, and a folded piece of paper containing a carefully drawn pattern. Marlowe traced the lines with his finger, observing the rhythm and precision, sensing the quiet narrative that continued to unfold, deliberate and patient, across marsh, lake, hills, and forest. A gravel road led toward an abandoned roadside diner, its windows dark, paint faded, and a faint smell of wood smoke lingering. Inside, Marlowe noted that menus had been carefully folded and stacked on tables, and small arrangements of salt shakers and cups formed subtle geometric patterns. He ran his fingers along a window sill, noting faint scratches forming a pattern similar to ones he had observed elsewhere, deliberate, slow, patient, woven into the environment as if speaking a quiet language meant for attentive observation. A trail beyond the diner led into a grove of old oaks, the ground soft with fallen leaves. Small wooden markers had been placed here and there, faint carvings almost imperceptible. Marlowe followed slowly, tracing their placement, noticing how each led to another, subtle sequences, guiding attention, forming a patient, deliberate narrative in the quiet forest. At the far edge of the grove, a small wooden cabin appeared, almost hidden beneath branches. Smoke rose faintly from a narrow chimney, and the soft scent of pine and herbs drifted through the air. The door opened to reveal a single room, lined with shelves containing notebooks, small sketches, and carefully arranged objects. Marlowe observed quietly, noting the precise, gentle care in every placement, the deliberate, immersive rhythm of the narrative continuing to unfold in subtle traces across the landscape. A narrow dock stretched into a quiet inlet from the edge of the nearby pond. A small rowboat was tied loosely, oars resting inside, and a notebook lay open, pages blank yet worn soft. Marlowe ran his fingers along it, sensing careful, deliberate use. Outside, reeds swayed gently, water rippled quietly, and the fog began to settle, curling across the surface and softening the edges of the world, allowing the patient narrative to continue its slow, immersive, deliberate unfolding. The forest beyond the dock led to a series of soft hills, narrow paths winding between pines and low shrubs. Small traces marked the way, stones balanced, leaves placed atop roots, subtle depressions in moss. Marlowe walked slowly, observing each sign, listening to the gentle rhythm, and tracing the quiet, patient story woven throughout marsh, lake, hills, forest, and abandoned structures, deliberate and persistent in its calm, immersive flow. Along a quiet road near the hills, he discovered a small ranger station partially hidden among tall grass. Smoke rose softly from the chimney, and he noticed faint marks in the soil, small patterns of footprints that appeared and disappeared, deliberate yet elusive. Inside, maps and sketches of marshes, lakes, trails, and cabins were neatly arranged, showing subtle patterns that mirrored the quiet traces scattered across the landscape. From the station, a narrow path led to an abandoned boathouse at the lake's far end. Its planks creaked softly underfoot. Inside, remnants of sails and ropes were carefully stacked, and a single lantern rested on a shelf, unlit. The faint scent of aged wood and water hung in the air. Marlowe noticed small scratches along the beams, forming delicate, deliberate patterns. Each mark felt intentional, like the environment itself was recording the quiet rhythm of presence and careful movement. The forest beyond the boathouse opened into a soft clearing, wildflowers muted in the evening light. A small platform of stones had been placed among them, with feathers and smooth pebbles resting gently atop. Marlowe knelt, observing the care in their arrangement. The clearing exhaled in muted rhythm, quiet and deliberate, as though inviting attentive observation, patient and calm in its subtle unfolding. A narrow trail led from the clearing toward distant hills, winding past abandoned cabins, moss-covered fences, and fields swaying gently in the breeze. Along the path, small tokens appeared, stones, feathers, twigs arranged with careful attention. Marlowe moved slowly, noting the deliberate rhythm, the gentle persistence of presence, and the patient, immersive narrative continuing quietly across marsh, lake, forest, and hills. At the edge of the hills, a small wooden cabin rested near the crest. Smoke rose softly from the chimney, the structure muted in the evening light. Inside, notebooks, sketches, and carefully arranged objects lined shelves. Marlowe observed quietly, noting the precision and care in each placement, the gentle, patient rhythm of the unfolding narrative, deliberate and immersive, echoing softly through the surrounding landscape. A narrow dock stretched from the pond near the cabin, a rowboat tied gently, oars resting inside. A notebook lay atop a bench, pages blank yet softened by use. Marlowe traced his fingers along its surface, sensing the deliberate, patient attention embedded in its wear. Outside, reeds swayed, water rippled gently, and the fog began to settle, curling softly across the pond. The story continued quietly, patiently, deliberately, and immersively, waiting for observation in the calm rhythm of marsh, lake, hills, and forest. A winding gravel road led beyond the cabin, past abandoned cottages and soft hills into thick groves of pine. Small arrangements of stones, feathers, and leaves appeared at intervals, subtle and deliberate. Marlowe followed slowly, observing each trace, listening to the calm rhythm of presence, tracing the quiet, immersive narrative unfolding across the landscape with gentle persistence and patient care. From a ridge overlooking the lake, he noticed a small structure partially concealed by trees. Its roof was intact, walls weathered. A faint lantern glow filtered through the windows. Inside, shelves held notebooks, sketches, and small objects arranged with careful, deliberate precision. Marlowe moved quietly, observing, noting the rhythm, presence, and pattern that continued to thread patiently through marsh, lake, forest, hills, and structures, revealing the story in whispers and subtle, deliberate traces. The narrow trail from the structure led to a hidden pond, water still and reflective under muted moonlight. A wooden platform extended slightly into the water, holding small stones, a feather, and a folded piece of paper with delicate, measured markings. Marlowe traced the lines with his finger, feeling the gentle rhythm of attention, the patient, immersive narrative unfolding across the environment, deliberate and quiet in its slow, persistent story. The forest paths beyond the pond wound into soft hills, their contours muted in evening light. Along them, small tokens continued to appear, subtle and deliberate. Stones balanced, leaves placed, faint depressions in soil suggesting careful movement. Marlowe walked slowly, observing, listening, and tracing the quiet, patient story that continued to unfold across marsh, lake, hills, and forest, immersive, calm, and deliberate in every subtle detail. A small, abandoned ranger station appeared among tall pines, its windows dark, chimney quiet. Outside, faint traces of careful movement marked the soil, deliberate, subtle, and almost imperceptible. Inside, maps, notebooks, and sketches displayed patterns mirroring traces observed throughout the landscape. Marlowe moved slowly, absorbing the rhythm of presence, the quiet narrative, patient and immersive, continuing its gentle, deliberate flow across the marsh, lake, forest, and hills. A narrow dock extended from a pond near the station. A small rowboat rested tied, oars inside. A notebook lay on its bench, blank yet worn, a subtle indentation suggesting careful use. Marlowe observed, touched it lightly, and listened to the marsh exhaling softly. The story continued, patient and deliberate, immersively unfolding across marsh, lake, forest, hills, and structures, whispering quietly in patterns and deliberate traces meant for attentive observation. A winding trail led into the woods beyond the dock, small tokens appearing along its edges, stones, feathers, leaves, subtle depressions in moss. Marlowe followed slowly, noting the careful rhythm of placement, observing the gentle persistence of presence. The immersive, calm story continued to unfold quietly, deliberately, and patiently, tracing patterns and rhythms across the landscape in whispers and delicate traces, inviting close, attentive observation. The pond mirrored muted moonlight, water rippling faintly, reeds swaying gently. Marlowe knelt by the dock, touching the worn wood of the rowboat, observing small stones and feathers resting atop the bench. Fog began to curl softly across the water and edges of the forest, muffling sound, softening forms. Every detail, the traces along trails, the deliberate placements, the rhythm of wind, water, and earth, contributed to the quiet, patient, immersive story unfolding deliberately across the marsh, lake, hills, and woods. A gravel road wound from the pond toward distant hills, past abandoned cottages, groves of pines, and wildflower fields. Subtle traces continued along the path: stones, feathers, leaves, small impressions in the soil, all deliberate. Marlowe moved slowly, noting each one, observing the rhythm of presence, tracing the quiet, immersive narrative unfolding gently, persistently, patiently, across marsh, lake, forest, hills, and structures, calm and deliberate in every nuance. A small cabin appeared at the crest of a hill, smoke curling from its chimney softly. Inside, shelves lined with notebooks, sketches, and carefully arranged objects suggested deliberate attention, gentle, patient observation. Marlowe moved quietly, observing, noting the rhythm, presence, and patterns that continued to thread patiently across marsh, lake, forest, hills, and structures, revealing the story in whispers, subtle traces, and quiet, deliberate signs. A wooden dock stretched from a pond nearby, a rowboat tied loosely, oars resting inside, a notebook atop the bench. Marlowe touched the worn surface, sensing the patient, deliberate care in its use. Reeds swayed, water rippled gently, and fog settled softly over the landscape. The story continued, quiet, patient, immersive, deliberate, waiting to be traced in subtle signs, patterns, and gentle, persistent rhythms across marsh, lake, forest, and hills. A narrow trail wound into the forest beyond the pond, small arrangements of stones, feathers, and leaves marking its edges. Marlowe walked slowly, observing each trace, feeling the rhythm of presence and deliberate attention. The immersive narrative continued to unfold gently, patiently, quietly, across marsh, lake, forest, hills, and structures, revealing itself through whispers, subtle patterns, and deliberate, measured traces. A low ridge opened into a clearing, moonlight soft, wildflowers muted. A small platform of stones lay among them, feathers and pebbles arranged carefully atop. Marlowe knelt, tracing the gentle rhythm of placement, sensing the quiet story unfolding patiently across the landscape, deliberate, immersive, and persistent, continuing slowly through marsh, lake, forest, hills, and the soft, muted world beyond. The gravel road led past abandoned cottages, soft hills, and groves of pines. Small tokens, stones, feathers, leaves, appeared with careful intention along the path. Marlowe followed slowly, observing, listening, tracing the patient, immersive narrative, deliberate and gentle, weaving quietly across marsh, lake, forest, hills, and structures, continuing its calm, persistent story. A small, abandoned ranger station appeared among tall pines. Smoke from the chimney was faint. Outside, subtle traces of careful movement marked the soil. Inside, maps, notebooks, and sketches mirrored patterns seen elsewhere. Marlowe moved slowly, absorbing the quiet rhythm, the deliberate presence, tracing the gentle, immersive narrative unfolding patiently, deliberately, quietly, across marsh, lake, forest, and hills. Marlowe paused at the crest, letting the soft night air settle around him. He looked back over the marsh, the lake, the scattered cabins, and the gentle rise of the hills, noticing for the first time how each path, dock, and trail seemed to connect, forming a quiet, deliberate network. The patterns of stones, feathers, and leaves, once isolated and mysterious, now appeared as markers, small guides laid carefully to indicate presence, attention, and passage. He returned slowly to the cabin atop the hill, carrying the notebooks, sketches, and small tokens he had collected. The gentle glow of the lantern inside illuminated shelves filled with maps and journals, each annotated with careful observations. As he spread the materials across the table, the subtle rhythm of the marks began to make sense. Someone had been documenting the marsh, the forest, and the hills, quietly observing the natural world, tracing paths and patterns, leaving gentle signals for a visitor to notice. The realization came softly, like dawn creeping over the distant hills. The footprints, the arranged stones, the folded papers, the careful sketches, all of it was part of a slow, patient practice of presence. Whoever had left these traces had moved deliberately, observing without disturbing, recording without claiming. Each small token had been intended to guide, to mark attention, to invite quiet awareness. Marlowe examined a page from a notebook that contained sketches of the marsh at different times of day, noting how subtle differences had been recorded, the way light struck the reeds, how fog settled over the water, where shadows stretched across trails. The markers outside, the stones, the feathers, aligned with these sketches. They were not signs of danger or conflict, but of mindfulness, of patient observation, almost meditative in their intent. He visited the ranger station again, spreading the collected sketches across the table. The ranger studied them quietly, nodding. "I remember seeing them," he said softly. "Someone moved through the hills and marsh every morning, quietly, carefully. They never took anything. They left marks, small, deliberate things. I thought it was odd, but there was never harm, just attention." The pieces fit together slowly. The abandoned cabins were not shelters for secret acts, but points of quiet observation. The docks and rowboats had not been abandoned recklessly. They were places from which to watch, to document, to leave subtle notes for others willing to follow, to notice the calm patterns woven into the environment. Each trace, every careful arrangement, became part of a larger narrative. Someone had been mapping the marsh, the forest, and the hills with patience and care, leaving a gentle guide to understanding the natural world and its rhythms. Marlowe returned to the clearing where he had seen the platform of stones and feathers. For the first time, he noticed the alignment. The stones formed subtle arrows pointing toward vantage points, the feathers marking stops for reflection. It was not a trail meant for escape or concealment, but for meditation and attention, a deliberate invitation to slow down, to watch, to notice. He walked slowly along the familiar trails, retracing steps through the hills, forest, and marsh. Each small clue, once mysterious, now fit into the quiet logic of observation and reflection. He understood that the pattern of presence, the deliberate placement of objects, the gentle sketches and markings, had been a form of storytelling without words, a story of the land, of attention, and of calm awareness, patiently waiting for someone to follow its quiet rhythm. By the lake, he sat on the dock and looked across the still water, observing the reeds, the gentle ripple of wind, the muted reflection of the hills. The rowboat remained, the notebook atop its bench. He opened it, touching the blank pages, now seeing them not as absence but as invitation to watch, to record, to move gently through the world, noticing what might otherwise go unseen. Returning to the cabins, the abandoned mill, the ranger stations, he realized each place had served a similar purpose. Small, deliberate acts of observation, each trace forming a subtle network of presence across the landscape. The previous sense of unease dissolved, replaced with a quiet understanding. The mystery was never about danger or concealment. It had been about care, mindfulness, and the gentle guidance of attention. Marlowe walked back through the forest, along the narrow trail winding past wildflowers, moss-covered stones, and faintly marked paths. The subtle arrangements of stones and feathers no longer seemed cryptic or strange. Instead, they were invitations, gentle prompts to slow down, to notice the small details, to move with attention and patience. In the clearing beyond, the platform of stones and feathers reflected moonlight softly. He knelt, observing the careful placement, feeling the quiet presence that had moved through the hills and marsh. Each detail now resonated with purpose, a slow, deliberate narrative that had been unfolding all along. The markers, the sketches, the footprints, they were all part of a calm, reflective story, patiently told through presence and observation. Marlowe returned to the rowboat on the dock at the edge of the lake. The water lapped gently, the reeds swayed, and fog settled softly across the surface. He picked up the satchel and notebooks, running his fingers across the covers, feeling the rhythm of deliberate care. The story had never been dramatic, violent, or urgent. It had been patient, reflective, and immersive, a quiet investigation into attention itself, a slow unfolding of presence woven into the natural world. At the ranger station, he spoke again to the man who had observed the patterns over the years. "It's about noticing," the ranger said quietly. "Watching, moving gently, leaving traces, not to alarm, not to hide, but to guide." Marlowe nodded, understanding fully for the first time. The footprints, the feathers, the arranged stones, they were markers of mindfulness, small gestures meant to teach careful observation, to invite reflection on the marsh, the hills, the forest, and the quiet rhythm of life within them. He spent the next few days retracing the paths slowly, following the traces deliberately, observing the landscape with new attention. Each small clue revealed its purpose: subtle arrangements, gentle sketches, quiet markers, all guiding the eye, the mind, and the spirit toward observation, calm, and reflection. The mystery was not one of danger or wrongdoing, but of presence itself. A careful, patient narrative written across marsh, lake, hills, and forest, waiting for someone to notice and follow its gentle, deliberate rhythm. From the hilltop, looking back across the expanse, everything aligned. The marsh, the lake, the forests, the trails, the cabins, the docks. Each mark, each trace, each small gesture contributed to a slow, immersive story of attention and mindfulness. Marlowe breathed deeply, feeling the calm rhythm of the land and the quiet presence that had moved through it all, and for the first time, he understood that the mystery was complete not in answers or revelation, but in reflection, observation, and the deliberate unfolding of quiet, persistent care. He lingered at the edge of the marsh, listening to the water, wind, and reeds, letting the gentle patterns of the landscape settle in his mind. Each small stone, feather, and sketch now spoke clearly, a narrative woven not in haste but in patience. The story, once mysterious and elusive, had become a quiet meditation on presence, observation, and the careful, deliberate attention of someone who had moved softly through the world, leaving a trail of subtle, reflective guidance across marsh, lake, hills, and forest. The moon dipped lower, casting muted silver across the water. Marlowe rose slowly, following the trails one last time, each step deliberate, reflective. The cabins, docks, trails, and markers all seemed to exhale softly in the night air. The mystery, once quiet and unresolved, had gently revealed itself, not in dramatic revelation, but in the patient, immersive rhythm of observation, presence, and quiet care woven into the landscape itself. The forest paths, the marsh edges, the hillsides, all whispered their soft, deliberate stories. Marlowe moved among them slowly, noticing how each subtle trace connected to the next. Every feather, every stone, every faint footprint formed a pattern of mindful presence, a narrative of calm, reflective attention. And as he traced these connections, he understood. The mystery had always been about noticing, about being present, about moving with care through a world that rewarded gentle, patient observation. He returned to the clearing with the platform of stones, kneeling to study it once more. The patterns, the placement, and the quiet deliberation spoke of someone who had moved not to hide, but to guide, not to alarm, but to invite attention. The realization settled softly, a quiet understanding that required no words, only awareness, presence, and the gentle unfolding of observation across marsh, lake, hills, and forest. From the dock by the pond, Marlowe watched the water ripple gently beneath the moonlight, reeds swaying softly in the breeze. The rowboat rested quietly, the satchel and notebook atop its bench. Everything, trails, markings, sketches, footprints, and subtle arrangements, made sense in the calm logic of careful observation. The mystery had resolved not through confrontation, but through reflection, patience, and the deliberate, gentle rhythm of presence woven across the land. He walked the trail slowly, revisiting each marker and arrangement, connecting the paths across hills, forests, marsh, and lake. The quiet realization persisted. This had never been about secrecy or danger. It had been about mindfulness, about teaching careful observation, about leaving gentle signals for someone who would notice, follow, and reflect. Each step, each trace, each pattern became part of the immersive, reflective story patiently laid across the landscape. The soft wind rustled reeds and leaves. Moonlight shimmered across the lake, fading into mist. Marlowe paused on a hilltop, looking back across the interconnected network of trails, docks, cabins, and platforms. Every subtle gesture, every carefully placed stone, every feather, every sketch now revealed itself as part of a single, quiet purpose. Patient, immersive presence, a story written not in haste or drama, but in reflection, attention, and the gentle, deliberate unfolding of care across marsh, lake, hills, and forest. The marsh exhaled softly, water lapping against reeds, fog curling gently over the surface. Marlowe lingered, listening to the rhythm of the world around him, noticing how each subtle trace, each deliberate placement, each careful sketch now connected seamlessly to form a quiet narrative. The mystery had resolved in reflection and understanding, revealing a story not of fear or secrecy, but of observation, patience, and the gentle, deliberate presence of someone who had moved softly across the landscape, leaving behind a quiet, immersive path for those willing to notice. He stepped slowly back along the trails, connecting each hill, cabin, dock, and platform in his mind. Stones, feathers, sketches, and footprints all now resonated with clarity. The quiet narrative unfolded gently, patiently, deliberately, revealing a calm, reflective story of presence and mindfulness, woven across marsh, lake, hills, and forest, waiting to be observed, understood, and quietly followed. The rowboat on the dock swayed softly, the satchel atop its bench, the notebook gently resting inside. Reeds whispered in the evening breeze, water rippled faintly, and the fog settled across the marsh in muted silver. Marlowe knelt, observing once more, sensing the gentle, deliberate care that had guided every trace, every placement, and every sketch. The story was complete not in answers or revelation, but in reflection, awareness, and the immersive, patient rhythm of quiet presence across the landscape.